Deep beneath the lands between, hidden among mist-shrouded peaks and forgotten pathways, lies a truth that shatters everything we thought we knew about Queen Marika the Eternal. The Shaman village predates her reign by centuries, serving as a hidden sanctuary for those who rejected the Golden Order's dogma, a place where the faithful gathered not to worship the Erd tree, but to preserve something far older, something the Golden Order sought to erase from history entirely. This revelation is not merely a footnote in the annals of the lands between, but the keystone to understanding the entire foundation upon which Marika built her empire, the secret origin of her godhood, and the tragic cycle of betrayal, ascension, and suffering that would culminate in the shattering itself. The village, nestled in a realm untouched by the golden light that would later bathe the world, was home to a people who communed with forces predating the greater will, shamans who understood the primordial nature of life and death in ways that the Golden Order would later condemn as heresy. These were not primitive mystics huddling in ignorance, but keepers of ancient wisdom, practitioners of arts that merged flesh and spirit in ways the crucible itself had once allowed, before the age of separation and purity that Marika would enforce with divine authority. Among these shamans, in this village of whispers and old magic, a child was born who would become the vessel for a god, a woman who would ascend to heights unimaginable and yet never escape the shadow of her origins, never forget the people she came from and the price they paid for her divinity. Marika's story is inseparable from the shaman village, for it was here that she learned the fundamental truth that would shape her entire philosophy, that gods are made, not born, and that the making requires sacrifice beyond comprehension. The village's fate and Marika's rise are two threads of the same tapestry, woven together in blood and ambition, in love and betrayal, in the desperate hunger for transcendence that defines the very nature of the lands between. What happened in that village, what was done to its people, what Marika witnessed or participated in or survived, these are the questions that unlock not only her character but the entire metaphysical architecture of Elden Ring's world. The Golden Order, with its rigid hierarchies and its obsession with purity, with its condemnation of those who are different, with its systematic erasure of inconvenient truths, all of this stems from choices made in the shadow of that village, decisions that rippled forward through time to touch every corner of the lands between. The shamans practiced a form of spirituality that acknowledged the messy, chaotic, beautiful complexity of existence, the intermingling of all things that the crucible had once embodied, and this philosophy stood in direct opposition to the order Marika would later impose, an order built on separation, on hierarchy, on the suppression of anything that did not fit within its golden boundaries. To understand why Marika shattered the Elden Ring, why she turned against the very system she had created, why her children inherited such profound curses and blessings, why the lands between descended into the chaos of the shattering, you must first understand what happened in that village, what was taken from her, what she took from others, and what she could never reclaim no matter how high she ascended. The village was not merely her birthplace, but her crucible, the forge in which a mortal was transformed into something else, something greater and something infinitely more tragic. The shamans had a practice, a ritual, a way of merging souls and bodies that the greater will and its agents would later exploit, twisting something sacred into a tool of divine manufacture, and Marika, whether willing participant or unwilling victim, became the subject of this transformation. The horrors inflicted upon the shaman village, the experiments conducted, the lives consumed, the traditions perverted, these atrocities were not random acts of cruelty, but calculated steps in the creation of a god, and every subsequent tragedy in the lands between can be traced back to this original sin. Marika's children, each bearing their own curse, their own burden, reflect different aspects of her fractured nature, different pieces of the trauma she carried from those early days. Mesmer, hidden away and tasked with purging those who remembered the old ways, embodies her shame and her ruthlessness. Melina, burned and bodiless, carries the memory of sacrifice and the weight of purpose. Michaela and Millennia, cursed from birth, represent the cost of trying to transcend the limitations imposed by the very system Marika created. Godwin, the golden child who fell to death itself, symbolizes the ultimate failure of the Golden Order to protect what it claimed to hold sacred. Morgoth and Mog, the Omen twins hidden in the depths, are living reminders of what the Golden Order rejects. The Crucible's influence that Marika could never fully suppress. Each of these figures, each of these tragedies, connects back to the Shaman village, to the choices made there, to the knowledge preserved or destroyed, to the people who were sacrificed on the altar of Marika's ascension. The village itself, when you finally discover it in the shadow of the Erd tree, is a place of profound melancholy, a graveyard of dreams and traditions, where the ruins speak of a gentler time before the Golden Order's absolute dominion. The architecture, the artifacts, the lingering spirits all tell a story of a community that valued connection over hierarchy, that saw divinity in the natural world rather than an imposed order, that understood suffering as part of existence rather than something to be purged or hidden away. This was the world Marika came from, and this was the world she ultimately betrayed, whether by choice or by necessity, whether as perpetrator or as victim, or most likely as some complex combination of both. The Greater Will did not simply choose Marika at random. She was selected, prepared, transformed through processes that required the knowledge and the bodies of her own people, the shamans who had preserved ancient arts for generations. The village's isolation, its rejection of the emerging Golden Order, made it the perfect target, a repository of forbidden knowledge and a population that would not be missed by the wider world. What transpired there was a genocide dressed up as divine selection, an erasure of an entire way of life in service of creating something new, something that would claim to be eternal and perfect, but was built on foundations of blood and stolen wisdom. Marika's guilt, her eventual rebellion against the Greater Will, her shattering of the Elden Ring, all of these actions and take on new meaning when viewed through the lens of the Shaman village, when long before the Golden Order, long before Queen Marika would ascend to godhood, the lands between existed in a state of primordial chaos. This was the pre-Erd Tree era, the primordial age, a time when the world itself was still taking shape under forces far older and stranger than any empire or dynasty. At the heart of this ancient world stood not the Erd Tree as we know it, but something far more primal, the Crucible. The Crucible was not merely a source of power or a mystical wellspring. It was the fundamental essence of life itself, the churning, bubbling cauldron from which all existence emerged. Where the Erd Tree would later impose structure, hierarchy, and golden perfection, the Crucible knew only fusion, mutation, and endless transformation. The energies of the Crucible manifested as a swirling, chaotic force that permeated every corner of the nascent world. If you could have witnessed it, you would have seen reality itself in flux, shimmering with possibility. Life did not emerge in discrete, separate forms as it would in later ages. Instead, the Crucible blended everything together in combinations that defied categorization. Creatures bore the features of multiple beasts at once. Horns sprouted from flesh that might also grow scales or feathers. Tails, wings, and extra limbs appeared without rhyme or reason, each organism a unique experiment in the Crucible's endless laboratory. There was no hierarchy in this primordial soup of existence. A being with the body of a lion and the wings of a great bird held no more or less significance than a creature that crawled on 6 legs with the head of a serpent. All were equal children of the Crucible, all equally valid expressions of its creative chaos. In this world of constant transformation, the first humans, or proto-humans as they might more accurately be called, began to emerge from the same primordial forces that shaped everything else. These early people were not the refined, civilized beings that would populate Lindell or the Academy of Raya Lucaria in ages to come. They were raw, instinctual, and deeply attuned to the wild energies that surrounded them. Among these early humans, certain individuals demonstrated an unusual sensitivity to the crucible's power. They could feel its currents, sense its tides, and in rare cases, even channel its transformative energies through their own bodies. These individuals would become known as the proto-shamans, the first spiritual practitioners in a world that barely understood the concept of spirituality. The proto-shamans recognized that survival in this chaotic age required more than physical strength. It demanded understanding, adaptation, and communion with the forces that shaped reality itself. They began to gather together, forming the first nomadic tribes. These were not tribes in the sense of later civilizations, with formal structures and hereditary leadership. Instead, they were loose confederations of individuals who recognized their shared attunement to the crucible and sought safety and knowledge in numbers. These tribes wandered the primordial landscape, following the flows of crucible energy as they manifested in different regions. Where the crucible's power ran strong, strange phenomena occurred. Plants grew to enormous sizes overnight. Animals underwent spontaneous transformations. The very earth itself might shift and change, valleys becoming hills, rivers changing course without warning. The proto-shamans learned to read these signs, to predict where the crucible's energies would surge next, and to position themselves to harness that raw power. They developed the first crude rituals, wordless ceremonies of movement and gesture that seemed to resonate with the crucible's frequencies. When performed correctly, these rituals could produce remarkable effects. A shaman might temporarily take on the characteristics of a beast, growing claws or gaining enhanced senses. Another might cause plants to grow with accelerated speed, providing food for the tribe. These were not miracles in the sense that later incantations would be. They were simply a matter of learning to swim in the currents of primordial chaos rather than fighting against them. As the tribes wandered and the ages slowly turned, something remarkable began to happen. From the heart of the crucible itself, a structure began to emerge. This was the first great tree, a massive arboreal growth that dwarfed anything else in the landscape. The great tree was not the Erd tree. That golden symbol of order would come much later, imposed by forces that sought to tame and control the crucible's chaos. The great tree was instead a direct physical manifestation of the crucible itself, a living conduit through which primordial energies flowed into the world. Its roots stretched deep into the earth, tapping into the fundamental forces of existence. Its branches reached toward the sky, each one a pathway for the crucible's transformative power. The great tree grew without guidance, without purpose, without the imposition of any divine will. It simply was, existing as naturally as the mountains or the seas. Around its base, the crucible's energies were strongest, creating a zone of intense transformation where the boundaries between different forms of life became even more blurred than elsewhere. Creatures that dwelt near the great tree underwent constant metamorphosis, their bodies shifting from one configuration to another over the course of their lifetimes. Some grew larger, some smaller, some developed new appendages or lost old ones. All were touched by the crucible's endless experimentation. In this age, the distinction between beast and human was not the clear line it would become in later eras. Many beings existed in a state that was neither fully one nor the other, or perhaps both simultaneously. Humans might possess bestial features, tails and horns and eyes that gleamed with animal intelligence. Beasts might demonstrate reasoning and awareness that approached or even exceeded human cognition. This was not seen as aberrant or monstrous. It was simply the natural state of things, the way the crucible had shaped the world. The relationship between these hybrid beings and their more purely human or purely bestial counterparts was symbiotic rather than hierarchical. A tribe might include members who appeared fully human alongside others who bore obvious marks of their bestial nature, and all would be valued for their unique capabilities. From this environment of acceptance and fluidity, a new type of practitioner began to emerge. These were the first druids, distinct from the nomadic proto shamans in their approach to the crucible's power. Where the shamans sought to channel the crucible's energies for immediate practical purposes, the druids pursued something deeper. They wanted to commune with the crucible itself, to understand its nature, to achieve a state of unity with the primordial force that had given birth to all things. The druids developed elaborate rituals that went far beyond the simple ceremonies of the shamans. They would fast for days, depriving their bodies of sustenance until they entered altered states of consciousness. They would consume certain plants that grew near the great tree, fungi and roots that contained concentrated doses of crucible energy, sending their minds spiraling into visions of the primordial chaos. Through these practices, the druids claimed to touch the essence of the crucible directly. They spoke of experiencing the dissolution of self, of becoming one with the endless cycle of transformation and rebirth. Some druids underwent permanent physical changes as a result of their communion, their bodies marked forever by their contact with primordial forces. These changes were worn as badges of honor, visible proof of their deep connection to the crucible. The druids established sacred groves in places where the crucible's power ran especially strong, locations they identified through their rituals and visions. These groves became pilgrimage sites for others seeking to deepen their understanding of the primordial forces that shaped existence. Among the various tribes and groups that wandered the primordial world, one faction of shamans began to distinguish itself through the vision of its leader. This figure, known to history only as the first seer, possessed an extraordinary gift for perceiving the currents of fate and possibility that flowed through the crucible. The first seer was not a prophet in the sense of later religious traditions. They did not claim to speak for any god or higher power. Instead, they simply saw more clearly than others, their perception extending beyond the immediate present into the branching paths of potential futures. Through their visions, the first seer came to understand that the age of primordial chaos could not last forever, that forces were already stirring that would seek to impose structure and order upon the crucible's wild creativity. The first seer gathered followers, shamans who shared their belief that the crucible's chaos was not something to be tamed or overcome, but rather embraced and celebrated. This faction made a momentous decision. Rather than continuing their nomadic existence, they would establish a permanent settlement, a sanctuary where those who honored the crucible's untamed nature could gather and preserve their way of life against the changes that were surely coming. They chose a location carefully, a valley hidden among ancient hills where the crucible's energies flowed strong but stable. Here they founded the Shaman village, the first true settlement in a world that had known only wandering tribes. The Shaman village was unlike anything that had existed before. It was not built according to any grand plan or architectural vision. Instead, it grew organically, structures emerging in response to need, and shaped by the same principles of natural growth that governed the crucible itself. Dwellings were woven from living plants that the shamans coaxed into useful forms through their rituals. Paths wound through the settlement, following the natural contours of the land rather than imposing artificial geometry. At the center of the village, the shamans cultivated a grove of trees descended from seeds of the great tree itself, creating a focal point for their rituals and ceremonies. The shaman village quickly became more than just a settlement. It evolved into a hub, a gathering place for all those who sought to live in harmony with the crucible's untamed nature. Shamans from distant tribes made pilgrimages to the village, sharing knowledge and techniques. Druids came to study in the sacred grove, seeking deeper communion with primordial forces. Even those who bore the most extreme marks of the crucible's transformative power, individuals who might have been shunned or feared elsewhere, found acceptance within the village's boundaries. Here, a person with horns and a tail, with scales instead of skin, with eyes that glowed with inner fire, was not an aberration, but simply another expression of the crucible's infinite creativity. The first seer took their place as the spiritual heart of this community, though they claimed no formal authority or title. They simply guided, advised, and above all, warned. Through their visions, the first seer had perceived something that troubled them deeply. They spoke of a coming great order, a force that would rise to challenge and ultimately suppress the crucible's chaos. This order would impose hierarchy where there had been equality, establish rigid categories where there had been fluid transformation, and replace the wild diversity of the crucible with a single unified vision of how existence should be structured. The first seer prophesied that this great order would bring both wonders and horrors, that it would elevate some to unprecedented heights while crushing others beneath its golden weight. The omens were not always outcasts. In these early days, when the crucible's energies still flowed freely through the world, those born bearing the twisted horns, the extra limbs, the scales and feathers, and strange anatomical growths were seen as something else entirely. They were the blessed. The shamans of the village looked upon these beings, these living embodiments of the crucible's chaotic potential, and saw not monsters, but proof of the primordial force's favor. The mutations that would later be scorned, hidden away in sewers beneath grand capitals, were in this age worn openly, celebrated even. The shamans understood what later generations would forget, that the crucible did not distinguish between beauty and horror, between order and chaos. It simply was, and those who bore its marks carried within them the raw essence of all life's possibility. The omens walked among the shamans as honored guests, as living relics of the world's first breath. Some served as guardians, their formidable strength and resilience making them natural protectors of the sacred groves. Others became advisors, for it was believed that their closeness to the crucible granted them insight into the hidden currents of fate. The horns that sprouted from their flesh were not signs of curse but crowns of a sort, markers of divine attention. Yet even in this age of reverence, darker forces stirred. The gloam-eyed queen emerged from the shadows of history, a figure whose very existence challenged the notion that life should persist indefinitely. She was a deity in her own right, though her worship was never as widespread as what would come later. Where the crucible represented endless transformation and the continuation of life in all its forms, the gloam-eyed queen embodied something equally necessary, but far less celebrated. She wielded destined death, the principle that all things, even gods, must eventually end. Her power was not destruction for its own sake, but the enforcement of the natural cycle, the assurance that nothing could escape the ultimate transformation from being into non-being. In her hands, a destined death took the form of black flames, fires that did not merely burn flesh, but consumed the very essence of immortality itself. Those who defied the crucible's natural order, who sought to prolong their existence beyond what the cosmic balance allowed, found themselves facing her judgment. She was attended by her godskin apostles, zealots who wore the flayed hides of those they had slain, a grotesque practice that nevertheless held deep, symbolic meaning. The skin represented the final barrier between life and death, and by wearing it, the apostles proclaimed their mastery over that threshold. The shamans viewed the gloam-eyed queen with a mixture of respect and wariness. They understood that death was part of the cycle they venerated, yet her methods were extreme, her interpretation of the natural order uncompromising. Some among the village elders argued that she represented a necessary counterbalance, that without the threat of true death, beings would stagnate, refusing to transform and evolve as the crucible intended. Others worried that her power was too absolute, that destined death in the wrong hands could unmake the world itself. These debates filled many long nights around the sacred fires, but they remained philosophical, distant from immediate concern. That distance would not last. The first attack came without warning, though in hindsight the signs had been accumulating for months. A faction had been growing in the lands beyond the village, people who had turned away from the Crucible's chaotic embrace and toward something else, something they described as more pure, more golden, more ordered. These proto-Erd Tree zealots, as they would later be understood, saw the shaman's practices as heretical, their reverence for the Crucible as a worship of base chaos. The zealots spoke of a coming age of perfection, of a great tree that would bring order to the world's madness, of a power descending from the stars that would elevate humanity above the beasts and the dragons and all the other creatures that shared the land. They viewed the omens not as blessed, but as corrupted, as examples of what happened when the natural order was perverted by primordial forces that should have been left behind in the world's infancy. The attack itself was brutal and swift. The zealots came at dawn when the mist still clung to the valley and the shamans were engaged in their morning rituals. They carried weapons of forged steel, a relatively new technology that gave them advantage over the shamans' more primitive implements. Fire was their primary tool, for they sought not just to kill, but to purify, to burn away what they saw as corruption. Several of the outer dwellings were destroyed before the shamans could mount an effective defense. The omens fought with particular ferocity, their crucible-born strength allowing them to tear through the zealots' ranks, but the attackers had come prepared with blessed oils and sanctified blades, weapons that seemed specifically designed to harm those touched by the crucible. The battle raged for hours, and though the shamans eventually drove the zealots back, the damage was done. Buildings lay in ruins, sacred groves had been desecrated, and worst of all, several of the village's inhabitants had been taken captive, dragged away for purposes unknown but certainly dark. In the aftermath, as the shamans tended their wounds and mourned their losses, a more disturbing discovery was made. The first seer, the village's oldest and most respected oracle, had vanished. Her dwelling stood empty, undisturbed by the attack, as if she had simply walked out in the middle of the night and never returned. The only trace she left behind were carvings, dozens of them, scratched into the stone walls of her home with what must have been frantic urgency. The symbols were unlike anything in the shaman's traditional lexicon, a mixture of their ancient script and something else, something that seemed to depict a great tree with roots that stretched into the earth and branches that reached toward the heavens. Around this tree, the carvings showed figures bowing, offering themselves up, and from the tree's trunk flowed lines that the shamans interpreted as light or perhaps power. The most unsettling carving showed a figure that might have been Marika herself, though no one could say for certain, standing at the tree's base with arms raised, and above her head the seer had carved a single word in the old tongue that translated roughly to vessel or perhaps sacrifice. The shamans debated the meaning of these prophecies endlessly, but the seer herself was never found. Some believed she had been taken by the zealots, despite the lack of evidence. Others thought she had walked into the wilderness to die, as seers sometimes did when their visions became too terrible to bear. A few whispered that she had been taken by the very forces she had foreseen, claimed by the future she had glimpsed, so that she could not warn others more clearly. Whatever the truth, her absence left a void in the village's spiritual leadership that would never be fully filled. As if to confirm the seer's dire predictions, the world itself began to change in ways both subtle and profound. The crucible's influence, which had suffused every aspect of existence, for as long as anyone could remember, began to wane. It did not disappear, not entirely, but its presence grew fainter, like a fire slowly dying to embers. The shamans noticed it first in their rituals. Transformations that had once come easily now required greater effort and sacrifice. The spirits that had always answered their calls grew distant, their voices harder to hear. The very land seemed to be withdrawing, pulling its primordial energies back into hidden places, into the deep earth and the dark forests where human influence could not reach. In place of the crucible's chaotic vitality, something else began to manifest. On the horizon, visible from the high points around the shaman village, a golden light appeared. It was faint at first, easily dismissed as a trick of the dawn or the reflection of sunlight off distant mountains. But it persisted, night after night, growing slowly but steadily brighter. The light had a quality unlike natural illumination, something that seemed to bypass the eyes and speak directly to some deeper part of the soul. Those who gazed upon it too long reported feeling strange compulsions, urges to travel toward it, to offer themselves to whatever power generated such radiance. The shamans recognized this light as the harbinger the seer had warned of, the physical manifestation of what would become the greater will's influence in the world. They understood, with growing dread, that their age was ending, that the primordial forces they had served for generations were being supplanted by something vast and incomprehensible, something that descended from beyond the stars themselves. The social fabric of the world began to fray in response to these cosmic shifts. The beastmen, who had lived alongside humans since time immemorial, found themselves increasingly marginalized. In the Crucible's heyday, the distinction between human and beast had been largely irrelevant. Both were expressions of the same primordial force, both capable of transformation and growth. But as the golden light grew stronger and whispers of a coming order spread through the land, people began to embrace hierarchy, to create categories and divisions where none had existed before. The beastmen, with their animal features and their deep connection to the crucible's chaotic energies, were increasingly viewed as lesser, as creatures that belonged to a primitive past that the world was leaving behind. They were pushed out of mixed settlements, forced to establish their own communities in remote regions. Some beastmen fought back against this ostracism, leading to skirmishes and feuds that further poisoned relations. Others retreated willingly, sensing that the world that was coming would have no place for them, preferring isolation to the indignity of second-class status. It was in this climate of change and conflict that Godfrey first rose to prominence, though he was not yet the Elden Lord he would become, not yet touched by the grace that would define his later existence. In this era, he was simply a man, albeit an extraordinarily powerful one, a warrior of unmatched skill who had gathered other fighters to his banner. The dragons, ancient and terrible, had long dominated the skies and the high places of the world, and they viewed the growing human settlements with disdain and hunger. Godfrey saw in these creatures both a threat and an opportunity. By leading his warriors against the dragons, he could protect his people and establish himself as a leader worthy of the age that was dawning. The campaign against the dragons marked the first large-scale organized warfare the world had seen, a conflict that went beyond tribal raids or territorial disputes to become something approaching total war. The battles were apocalyptic in scale. Dragons wielded lightning and fire, their scales turning aside conventional weapons, their wings creating storms as they dove to attack. Godfrey's forces suffered terrible casualties in the early engagements, entire companies incinerated or scattered by the dragon's breath. But Godfrey proved to be a tactical genius as well as a warrior. He learned to use terrain to his advantage, to lure dragons into narrow valleys where their aerial superiority meant less, to coordinate attacks that struck at vulnerable points. He also began to recruit those touched by the crucible, including some omens who saw in his cause a chance to prove their worth into a world that was beginning to reject them. These crucible blessed warriors could withstand the dragon's attacks better than ordinary humans, their mutations granting them resilience and strength that made them invaluable shock troops. The shaman druids watched these developments with alarm. They saw their world being torn apart, the old ways giving ground to new ideologies and new powers. In an effort to preserve their knowledge, they began a massive project of recording everything they knew onto stone tablets. These were not simple inscriptions, but elaborate works that combined text, symbols, and even alchemical formulae, attempts to capture not just the facts of their practices, but the essence, the underlying principles that made their magic work. The tablets covered every aspect of shaman life, from the proper rituals for communing with the crucible, to the medicinal uses of various plants, to the songs that could calm or enrage the spirits. The work was painstaking and consumed months of effort from the village's most learned members. They carved by firelight and sunlight, their fingers bleeding from the work, driven by the terrible certainty that if they did not preserve this knowledge, it would be lost forever, swept away by the golden tide that was rising to drown their age. Some among the shamans took a more active approach to the changing world. A group of the younger druids, those who had grown up hearing stories of the zealots' attack and who had watched the beastmen being driven out, decided that if the new age valued strength and order, then the shamans would have to adapt. They began experiments with grafting crucible energies directly into weapons and armor, attempting to create tools that could channel the primordial force in concentrated martial ways. The results were crude but promising. Swords that sprouted thorns when swung, armor that hardened like bark when struck, shields that could root themselves to the ground with sudden growths. The most ambitious project involved attempting to create warriors who could permanently embody the crucible's power, fighters who would be to ordinary soldiers what the omens were to regular humans. These prototypes, the earliest ancestors of what would eventually become the Crucible Knights, were only partially successful. The grafting process was agonizing and often fatal, and those who survived were changed in ways that went beyond the physical, their minds touched by the Crucible's alien consciousness in ways that made them difficult to control. Far to the north, the fire giants observed these upheavals with their own concerns. These massive beings, who tended the flame of ruin atop their frozen mountain, understood that the golden light represented an existential threat. The flame they guarded was itself a primordial force, one of the fundamental powers that had shaped the world's creation, and they sensed that the coming order would not tolerate such competing sources of cosmic authority. In a move that surprised many, the fire giants reached out to the dragons, proposing an alliance against the encroaching forces of what would become the Golden Order. The dragons, who had their own reasons to fear a world dominated by the Greater Will's rigid hierarchies, agreed. This alliance shifted the balance of power dramatically, forcing Godfrey to adapt his strategies and seek new advantages. It was during this tumultuous period that the first Empyreans were born, individuals who possessed the potential to become vessels for the Elden Ring, to serve as conduits for the Greater Will's power in the physical world. The nature of Empyreans was not fully understood even by those who bore the designation, but certain signs marked them from birth. They possessed an unusual affinity for the golden light that now suffused the world, and they seemed to exist slightly apart from normal causality, as if they were anchored to something beyond the material plane. Among these first Empyreans was Marika herself, though her origins in this era remain frustratingly obscure. Some accounts place her birth in the Shaman village, suggesting she was one of their own, a child of the old ways who would paradoxically become the instrument of those ways' destruction. Other sources hint at different origins, at a birth touched by divine intervention or cosmic design. What is certain is that, even as a young woman, Marika displayed qualities that set her apart, a charisma and presence that drew others to her, and a connection to the golden light that seemed almost instinctive. The gloam-eyed queen, who had watched these developments with growing concern, finally moved to act. She saw in the greater will's emergence a threat to the natural cycle she had sworn to protect. If the Golden Order established itself fully, if the Elden Ring was allowed to reshape the laws of reality, then destined death itself might be subverted, trapped, made subservient to an immortal regime that would deny all things their proper end. She gathered her godskin apostles and prepared for war not against any mortal faction, but against the nascent divine order itself. Her campaign was fierce and initially successful, her black flames consuming those who had pledged themselves to the golden light. Her destined death striking down even those who thought themselves protected by the greater will's grace. For a time, it seemed she might actually succeed in preventing the Golden Order's rise, in preserving the old cycle of death and rebirth that had governed existence since the beginning. But she had underestimated the forces arrayed against her. The greater will had not come to this world unprepared, and it had already begun to work through mortal agents who possessed both the power and the will to oppose her. The betrayal, when it came, was swift and absolute. One of her own apostles, seduced by promises of eternal life, or perhaps simply broken by the weight of serving death incarnate, turned against her at a crucial moment. The details of the battle that followed are lost to history, but its outcome is clear. The gloam-eyed queen was defeated, her power over destined death sealed away by a nascent force that would later be identified with Malekith, the Black Blade, though whether he existed in this form so early is debated by scholars. What matters is that destined death was removed from the world, locked away where it could not interfere with the immortal age that was coming. The gloam-eyed queen herself vanished from history, her fate unknown, her followers scattered and hunted. With the gloam-eyed queen's defeat, the last major obstacle to the Golden Order's rise had been removed. The Shaman village, which had already been diminished by the Zealots' attack and the general waning of the Crucible's influence, now faced a final crisis. The call of the Golden Light had grown too strong to resist. Many of the younger shamans, including some who had worked on the stone tablets and the Crucible weapon projects, decided to leave, to travel toward that distant radiance and see what the new age might offer. They rationalized their departure in various ways, telling themselves they would return with knowledge of the new powers, that they could serve as bridges between the old ways and the new, but in their hearts they knew they were abandoning something that could never be recovered. The village elders watched them go with sorrow, but without anger, understanding that the tide of history could not be fought, only endured. Those who remained were the most devoted, the ones who would rather die than abandon the Crucible's worship, but even they knew their time was ending, that they were becoming relics of an age the world no longer wanted to remember. As the Crucible's influence waned and the world began to reshape itself under new cosmic forces, the last true druids, those who had served as living conduits between the primordial energies and mortal understanding, made their final retreat. These were not merely priests or scholars, but individuals whose very bodies had been transformed by prolonged exposure to the Crucible's chaotic blessings. Their flesh bore the marks of ancient power, horns and scales and wings that grew not as curses, but as sacred gifts. They withdrew into the deepest forests, places where the trees grew so thick that sunlight never touched the ground, where the roots of ancient oaks twisted into patterns that predated human language. Here they established hidden groves, sanctuaries where the old rites could continue in secret, away from the eyes of those who now viewed the Crucible's gifts as deformities rather than divine favor. These guardians carried with them the knowledge of rituals that could coax life from stone, that could speak to the spirits dwelling in every stream and hill, that could read the future in the patterns of growth and decay. They became hermits and recluses, their names forgotten by all but the most dedicated seekers of ancient wisdom. In their isolation, they preserved practices that the emerging order would soon declare heretical, maintaining a living link to an age that the world was rapidly leaving behind. The omens, those beings marked by the crucible's touch with horns and twisted features, found their sacred status violently reversed. Where once they had been revered as living proof of the primordial power's continued presence, they were now hunted with a fervor that bordered on religious mania. Emerging factions, proto kingdoms, and tribal confederations that sensed the coming of a new divine order began systematic campaigns to purge these crucible blessed individuals from their lands. The reasoning was both theological and practical. The new powers whispering promises of golden grace and eternal order demanded purity, a uniformity of form that reflected the geometric perfection of their cosmic vision. The omens, with their chaotic growths and unpredictable abilities, represented everything this new order opposed. Hunting parties scoured the countryside, dragging omen children from their homes, executing adults in public squares as warnings against the old ways. Some omens fled to the margins of civilization, hiding in sewers and catacombs, forming underground communities that would persist for generations. Others fought back, their crucible enhanced strength making them formidable opponents, but their resistance only deepened the fear and hatred directed toward them. The transition was not instantaneous, but occurred over decades, a slow genocide masked as religious purification. Former shamans who had celebrated omen births now participated in their suppression, either through genuine conversion to the new beliefs or simple survival instinct. The cultural memory shifted with disturbing speed. Within a single generation, children who would have been blessed and honored instead became sources of shame, hidden away, or abandoned to die in the wilderness. The primordial Erd tree, that cosmic sapling that had first appeared as a golden light on the horizon, continued its inexorable growth. Its roots spread beneath the earth like grasping fingers, seeking out and absorbing sources of power. Where these roots encountered the lingering wells of crucible energy, those pools of chaotic life force that had sustained the old world's vitality, they drank deeply. The process was not gentle. Witnesses in scattered settlements reported tremors in the earth, the sudden withering of ancient groves that had stood for millennia, the disappearance of sacred springs that had never run dry. The Erd tree was cannibalizing the crucible's remnants, converting that wild, untamed power into something more ordered, more controlled, more aligned with the geometric perfection demanded by the greater will. You could see the effect in the tree's growth pattern. Unlike natural trees that grew organically, responding to wind and weather and the contours of the land, the Erd tree grew with mathematical precision. Its branches extended at perfect angles, its trunk rose absolutely straight, its roots formed patterns that, when mapped, revealed sacred geometries. It was becoming not just a tree, but a living sigil, a three-dimensional rune that would anchor the new order to the physical world. The light it emitted grew stronger with each passing year, a golden radiance that could be seen from increasingly distant lands, drawing pilgrims and seekers who sensed that something momentous was occurring. Around its base, the land itself began to transform, grass taking on a golden sheen, stones developing a crystalline quality, the very air seeming to hum with potential. Marika, still in her youths, walked among the shamans during this transitional period, though her exact role remained shrouded in deliberate obscurity. The fragmentary accounts that survive paint contradictory pictures. Some texts describe her as a student, learning the old ways from the village elders, absorbing their knowledge of spirit communion and natural magic. Others suggest she was already set apart, marked by some quality that even the shamans recognized as extraordinary. There are references to her spending long hours in meditation before the village's sacred stones, to her participating in rituals that tested the limits of mortal endurance, to conversations with the eldest shamans that lasted through entire nights. What is clear is that she was present, during the village's final years of true vitality that she witnessed firsthand the traditions and practices that would soon be lost. Some scholars argue that this period was formative, that Marika's later actions as a goddess can only be understood in light of what she learned and experienced in the shaman village. Others contend that she was already an agent of the greater will even then, infiltrating the shamans to learn their secrets before facilitating their destruction. The truth, though, likely lies somewhere between these extremes. Marika was a young woman of exceptional ability, caught in a world undergoing catastrophic transformation, navigating between the old ways she had been born into and the new powers that offered transcendence at a terrible price. Her presence in the village during this period would later become a source of both legitimacy and controversy, proof that she understood the old ways even as she built an order that suppressed them. The first fingers, those alien envoys of the greater will, began making direct contact with select beings across the land. These were not the withered, imprisoned two fingers that would later be found in every major settlement, but active, mobile entities that sought out individuals of power and potential. Their appearance was profoundly disturbing to those raised in the crucible's organic chaos. The fingers were rigid, so geometric, their movements precise and mechanical despite their fleshy appearance. They communicated not through words, but through direct transmission of concepts and commands into the minds of those they contacted. The message they carried was consistent. The age of chaos was ending, a new order was ascending, and those who aligned themselves with the greater will would be granted power beyond mortal comprehension. The offer was not made to everyone. The fingers selected carefully, approaching warlords who controlled significant territories, shamans whose spiritual power could be redirected, scholars who had begun to perceive the mathematical underpinnings of reality. Each contact was a negotiation, an exchange of loyalty for divine favor. Some who were approached accepted immediately, overwhelmed by the cosmic vastness they suddenly perceived. Others hesitated, torn between the familiar world and the promise of something greater. A few refused outright and found themselves marked, their names recorded in some cosmic ledger as obstacles to be removed. The fingers established a network of converts, individuals who became the first true servants of the greater will, the foundation upon which the Golden Order would be built. These early converts began proselytizing, spreading word of the coming transformation, preparing populations for the upheaval that would soon sweep away the old world entirely. The last great ritual of the shamans was performed in desperation, a final attempt to revive the crucible's dominance and halt the inexorable rise of the new order. The remaining shamans gathered from their scattered villages, converging on the original settlement where the oldest stone still stood. They brought with them artifacts of immense age, relics from the primordial era when the crucible's power had been absolute. The ritual they planned was dangerous, requiring the participants to open themselves completely to the chaotic energies, to become vessels through which the crucible might manifest directly in the world. Preparations took months, sacred grounds were consecrated, ley lines were mapped and amplified, sacrifices were made to awaken dormant spirits. When the ritual finally began, it lasted for 3 days and nights without pause. The shamans chanted in languages that predated human speech, their voices blending into a single sustained note that resonated with the fundamental frequencies of creation itself. They danced patterns that mimicked the spiral growth of shells and the branching of lightning. They opened their veins and let their blood soak into the earth, offering their very life force to fuel the working. For a time, it seemed to work. Witnesses from distant settlements reported seeing impossible colors in the sky above the shaman village, hearing sounds that made stone weep and trees sing. The boundary between the physical and spiritual grew thin, and creatures from the primordial age began to manifest, drawn by the concentrated power. But the ritual ultimately failed. The crucible's time had passed. Its power, though not destroyed, had been too thoroughly suppressed, too much absorbed by the growing Erd tree. The working collapsed catastrophically. Several shamans died instantly, their bodies unable to contain the energies they had channeled. Others were transformed into something neither human nor beast, their minds shattered by contact with forces beyond mortal comprehension. The ritual's failure was not merely a magical setback, but a symbolic confirmation that the age had truly ended, that no amount of knowledge or will could reverse the cosmic tide. The dragons, those ancient beings who had ruled the skies since time immemorial, lost their dominion as the storm of the crucible faded. Their civilization, built on principles of eternal hierarchy and draconic supremacy, had been sustained by the primordial energies that suffused the world. Placidusax, the Elden Lord of the age before the Erd Tree, watched as the power that had elevated dragons above all other creatures began to ebb. The great storms that dragons commanded, those tempests of red lightning that could reshape landscapes, grew weaker with each passing year. Younger dragons found their innate abilities diminishing, their scales losing the near invulnerability that had made them apex predators. The dragon communion, that practice by which mortals could consume dragon hearts to gain their power, became increasingly dangerous as the dragons themselves became more desperate and aggressive. Placidusax retreated to Farum Azula, the crumbling sky city that served as the dragon's greatest stronghold, and entered a state of dormant meditation, waiting for the return of a god who would never come. Other dragons scattered, some allying with the emerging human kingdoms in exchange for protection and sustenance, others retreating to remote peaks and deep caverns where they could nurse their fading power in isolation. The loss of draconic dominion created a power vacuum that accelerated the rise of human civilizations, allowing settlements to expand into territories that had previously been too dangerous to inhabit. The fire giants, those colossal beings who had tended the flame of ruin atop the mountaintops of the giants, found themselves cursed as divine retribution swept across their civilization. The exact nature of their transgression remains debated, but the consequences were unmistakable. Their numbers began to dwindle, children born weak or not at all, their great forges cooling as the sacred fire they had guarded for generations turned against them. Some accounts suggest the curse was imposed by the greater will itself, punishment for the giants' refusal to submit to the coming order. Others argue it was a consequence of their own desperate actions, a price paid for attempting to use the flame of ruin to resist the cosmic transformation. Whatever the cause, the effect was devastating. The giants' mighty civilization, which had produced wonders of metalwork and architecture, collapsed within a few generations. Their great cities in the mountains were abandoned, left to be buried under snow and ice. The surviving giants became scattered and isolated, their culture fragmenting into isolated family groups that could barely remember the glory of their ancestors. The flame of ruin itself was contained, bound by rituals and wards that would prevent its use against the emerging Golden Order, though it could never be fully extinguished. The Shaman village fell into ruin as its remaining inhabitants either died out or were absorbed into the new orders rising across the land. The final years were marked by slow decay rather than dramatic catastrophe. The young left first, seeking opportunities in the growing settlements that clustered around the Erd tree, abandoning the old ways for the promise of stability and prosperity under the Golden Order. The elderly remained, maintaining the rituals as best they could with dwindling numbers, but their knowledge died with them, unrecorded and untransmitted. The buildings, constructed with techniques that harmonized with natural forces rather than dominating them, began to deteriorate without the constant spiritual maintenance they required. Roofs collapsed, walls crumbled, the sacred stones were toppled or buried. The gardens that had produced medicinal herbs and ritual plants were overgrown by common weeds. The spirits that had dwelt in the village, sustained by generations of shamanic attention, faded or fled to wilder places. Within a few decades, the village that had been a center of spiritual power was reduced to scattered ruins, recognizable only to those who knew what to look for. Some former inhabitants thus did assimilate into the new order, becoming priests or scholars, translating what they could of the old knowledge into forms acceptable to the Golden Order's theology, though much was necessarily lost or deliberately suppressed in the translation. The crucible itself was sealed beneath the emerging Erd tree, its energies suppressed but not destroyed. This was perhaps the Greater Will's greatest achievement, the final act that secured the Golden Order's dominion. The sealing was not a single event, but a gradual process accomplished through the Erd tree's continuous growth and the systematic suppression of crucible manifestations across the land. The tree's roots formed a living prison, wrapping around and containing the wells of primordial power, channeling their energy upward to fuel the Erd tree's own growth. Runes were carved into bedrock, establishing metaphysical barriers that prevented the crucible's chaotic influence from reaching the surface. Rituals were performed at sites of power, binding the old energies with chains of golden light. The suppression was effective, but incomplete. The crucible's power was too fundamental, too deeply woven into the fabric of reality to be entirely eliminated. It remained buried and bound, a reservoir of chaotic potential that would occasionally leak through in the form of omens and misbegotten, living reminders that the old power had not been destroyed, merely contained. This imperfect sealing would have profound implications for the future, creating a fundamental instability at the heart of the Golden Order, a crack in the foundation that would eventually widen into catastrophic fracture. The age of the Crucible ended not with a dramatic battle or cataclysmic event, but with a gradual fading, a slow transition as the Golden Order began its ascent and established the structures that would define the next era. The world that emerged was fundamentally different from what had come before, more ordered but less vital, more stable but less free, more beautiful but less alive. And in the ruins of the shaman village on a stone that would remain hidden for centuries, the last known shaman carved a final warning, words that would prove prophetic. The crucible will return when the order falters. We now arrive at the dawn of the Golden Order, a pivotal transformation that would reshape the lands between forever. As the age of the crucible drew to a close, a new power emerged from beyond the fog-shrouded seas. It was during this early Erdtree era, at the very beginning of what historians would call the Golden Order dawn, that a woman named Marika arrived on these shores, and with her came a vision that would supplant every belief system that had come before. Marika was a Numen, a member of a long-lived race that originated in lands far beyond the fog that surrounded the lands between. The Numen were known for their extended lifespans and their connection to forces that predated even the Greater Will's influence in this realm. Marika herself carried secrets from her homeland, knowledge of divine ascension, and the mechanisms by which gods could be made and unmade. When she first set foot in the lands between, the land was still fragmented, still caught between the fading reverence for the crucible and the various powers that sought to claim dominance. She arrived not as a conqueror, but as something far more dangerous, a vessel waiting to be filled with purpose. Her path to godhood began with an alliance that would define an entire age. Marika became the consort of Godfrey, a warrior of unmatched prowess who had already carved out a reputation as a chieftain among the scattered tribes and kingdoms. Godfrey was no mere soldier. He was a force of nature, a man who had tamed the Storm Lord and claimed dominion over the wild lands through sheer martial excellence. His given name was Huara Lu, and he embodied the raw, untamed strength that characterized the Age Before Order. When Marika and Godfrey united their forces, they created something unprecedented, a combination of divine mandate and overwhelming military might. Their union was both political and personal, a partnership that would see Godfrey crowned as the first Elden Lord, a title that had never existed before and would become the template for all who followed. But the true transformation came when Marika ascended to become the vessel of the Elden Ring itself. The Elden Ring, that fundamental ordering principle of reality, required a physical host, a god who could embody its laws and enforce its structure upon the world. Through means that remain partially obscured by time and deliberate obscuration, Marika underwent a transformation that elevated her from Numen warrior to divine being. She became Queen Marika the Eternal, a goddess in flesh, and within her body the Elden Ring found its anchor in the physical world. This was not simply a coronation or a ritual of investiture. This was a fundamental alteration of her being, a merger of mortal and cosmic that allowed her to perceive and manipulate the very runes that constituted reality's foundation. The greater will, that inscrutable outer force that sought to impose order upon the chaos of existence, designated Marika as its emissary in the lands between. This designation carried with it an authority that transcended any earthly power. The greater will communicated through the two fingers, enigmatic entities that served as intermediaries between the cosmic and the terrestrial. Through these fingers, Marika received her mandate to establish a new hierarchy, a new system of belief and governance that would bring all the disparate peoples and powers of the lands between under a single unified structure. The divine authority granted to her was absolute within the framework of the Golden Order. She could determine what was holy and what was heretical, what was blessed and what was cursed. She became, in effect, the living law. As a manifestation of this new order, the Erd Tree emerged. Where once the crucible had represented the primordial chaos from which all life sprang, the Erd Tree stood as a symbol of hierarchy, purity, and divine structure. The great golden tree rose from the heart of the lands between, its roots spreading deep into the earth, its branches reaching toward the heavens. It was not merely a tree but a cosmic axis, a world tree that connected the earthly realm to the divine. The Erd Tree glowed with an inner radiance, a golden light that could be seen from every corner of the land. Its presence was inescapable, a constant reminder of the new order that had taken root. Unlike the crucible, which had been a source of wild, unpredictable life force, the Erd Tree represented controlled growth, sanctioned blessing, and ordained power. The Golden Order declared that the Erd Tree's grace was now the sole legitimate source of divine blessing in the lands between. Grace manifested as golden light, visible to those chosen by the Erd Tree, guiding them toward greatness and marking them as favored by the divine order. This grace replaced the older forms of blessing that had been associated with the crucible and other primordial forces. To receive the Erd Tree's grace was to be recognized as part of the ordained hierarchy, to have your existence validated by the cosmic order itself. Those who could not see the grace, or from whom it had been stripped away, were considered lesser, outside the bounds of the Golden Order's protection and favor. This binary system of inclusion and exclusion became one of the fundamental organizing principles of the New Age. With the establishment of the Erd Tree's supremacy came a necessary corollary, the demonization of what had come before. The crucible, once revered as the primordial form of life from which all things emerged, was systematically branded as heretical. The Golden Order's theologians and scholars worked to rewrite history, to recontextualize the crucible not as a sacred source, but as a chaotic aberration, a primitive stage that had been rightfully superseded by the Erd Tree's perfected order. Those aspects of life that bore the marks of the crucible, the horns and wings and tails that had once been seen as blessings, were now viewed with suspicion and disgust. The crucible knights, who had once been honored warriors, embodying the primordial life force, found their traditions marginalized and their beliefs suppressed. The very concept of the crucible was to be forgotten, buried beneath layers of Golden Order doctrine that insisted on the Erd tree as the beginning and end of all legitimate divine power. This ideological transformation required enforcement, and Godfrey provided exactly that. As the first Elden Lord, he led the Golden Order's armies in a campaign of conquest and unification that would bring every corner of the lands between under Marika's dominion. Godfrey's military genius was matched only by his ferocity in battle. He commanded legions of soldiers who fought under the banner of the Erd Tree, spreading the Golden Order's influence through a combination of overwhelming force and the promise of grace. Kingdom after kingdom fell before his advance. The scattered tribes and independent realms that had flourished during the Age of the Crucible found themselves faced with a choice: submit to the Golden Order or be destroyed. Most chose submission, recognizing that resistance against such a unified and divinely sanctioned force was futile, but not all submitted willingly. Hidden in the remote reaches of the lands between, far from the Erd Tree's radiant center, there existed a settlement that would become a thorn in the Golden Order's side. The Shaman village was a small, isolated community that had preserved traditions far older than Marika's reign. These were not merely holdouts clinging to outdated customs. The shamans were fire worshippers, practitioners of ancient rituals that connected them to powers the Golden Order sought to erase. Their settlement was deliberately concealed, tucked away in a location that made it nearly inaccessible to outsiders. The villagers had developed their isolation into a form of protection, using the natural terrain and their own secretive practices to remain hidden from the expanding reach of the Golden Order. The shamans' religious practices centered on the flame of ruin and their reverence for the Fell God, a deity of fire and destruction that predated the Greater Will's influence in the lands between. The flame of ruin was no ordinary fire. It was a primordial force, a destructive power that could burn even the divine, that could reduce the works of gods to ash. The Fell God, imprisoned within the forge atop the mountaintops of the giants, represented a cosmic force entirely antithetical to the Golden Order's vision of eternal, unchanging hierarchy. For the shamans to continue worshiping this god, to tend the sacred flames and perform the old rituals, was an act of defiance against everything Marika's order represented. They preserved a knowledge of flame sorceries and fire incantations, magical arts that drew power from combustion and destruction rather than from the Erd Tree's golden light. These ancient rituals were not merely religious observances, but practical applications of power that threatened the Golden Order's monopoly on divine authority. The shamans could call upon flames that the Erd Tree's grace could not extinguish. They maintained traditions of prophecy and divination that used fire as a medium, seeing visions in the flames that sometimes contradicted the Golden Order's ordained future. Their very existence proved that alternative sources of power remained viable, that the Erd Tree's grace was not, in fact, the sole path to strength and transcendence. This made them dangerous, not because of their military might, which was negligible, but because of what they represented: the possibility of resistance, the persistence of older truths. Marika's forces, recognizing the threat posed by such dissent, launched systematic campaigns to suppress those who refused to abandon the old ways. The Golden Order's inquisitors and knights hunted down Crucible adherents wherever they could be found, destroying shrines and executing those who persisted in the old worship. Heretics were not merely killed, but erased, their names stricken from records, their works destroyed, their very existence denied by official histories. The campaign against dissent was thorough and brutal, designed not just to eliminate opposition, but to make it seem as though opposition had never existed. The Golden Order sought to create a reality in which its version of truth was the only version that had ever been, in which the Erd tree had always been supreme and alternatives had never been viable. Yet the Shaman village endured. Its remote location proved to be its salvation during these early purges. The village was situated in terrain that made approach difficult, surrounded by natural barriers that deterred casual discovery. The shamans had also developed a culture of absolute secrecy, teaching their children from birth never to speak of their home to outsiders, never to reveal the paths that led to their settlement. They maintained no trade with the outside world, produced no goods that might draw attention, and left no trails that could be followed. When Golden Order patrols passed through the general region, the shamans would extinguish their sacred flames temporarily, hiding all evidence of their presence until the danger passed. Their survival depended on remaining invisible, on being forgotten by the very forces that sought to eliminate them. The shamans were not alone in their resistance. The fire giants, a race of enormous beings who dwelled in the frozen peaks of the mountaintops, were natural allies to the fire-worshipping shamans. The fire giants were the keepers of the flame of ruin, the guardians of the forge where the fell god had been imprisoned. They were massive creatures, each standing several times the height of a man, with strength proportional to their size. More importantly, they possessed an innate connection to fire that made them immune to its destructive power and capable of wielding it as both tool and weapon. The fire giants had their own civilization, their own culture and history that stretched back to ages before the Erd tree's rise. They had no interest in submitting to the Golden Order, no desire to abandon their god and their sacred duty for the promise of grace. The Golden Order recognized the fire giants as a primary threat, both military and ideological. Godfrey's armies were directed toward the mountaintops with explicit orders to break the giants' power and seize control of the Flame of Ruin. This was not merely a military campaign, but a war of extermination, a deliberate attempt to erase an entire race because of what they represented and what they protected. The conflict between the Golden Order and the Fire Giants would become one of the defining wars of the early Erd Tree era, a brutal struggle fought in the harshest terrain imaginable, where the giants' mastery of fire met the disciplined might of Marika's armies. As the early Erd Tree era dawned, marking the Golden Order's true genesis, Queen Marika's ambition knew no bounds. She sought not just dominance, but absolute, unchallengeable supremacy for her new order. Her first great challenge, and indeed her first great act of consolidation, was the eradication of the fire giants, those ancient, formidable beings who dwelled in the mountaintops of the giants, and whose very existence intertwined with the fell flame, represented a direct affront to the Erd Tree's burgeoning light. Godfrey, her first Elden Lord, a warrior of unparalleled might and ferocity, was dispatched to wage a brutal, protracted war against them. This was no mere skirmish, but a campaign of annihilation, driven by Marika's unwavering resolve to extinguish any power that could rival or even question the Golden Order's dominion. Godfrey, fueled by Marika's directive, fought with a savage grace, his axe cleaving through the colossal forms of the fire giants, their fiery breath and molten attacks countered by the sheer force of his will and the nascent power of the Erd Tree's grace flowing through him and his warriors. The war was relentless, a testament to the fire giants' resilience, but ultimately it was a war they could not win against the combined might of Marika's will and Godfrey's strength. The fell flame, a primordial force of destruction, was seen as a heresy, a chaotic element that had no place in the meticulously ordered world Marika envisioned. Yet even as Godfrey battled the giants, Marika, ever the strategist, understood that certain threats required specialized tools. She commanded the creation of the Black Flame, a weapon born of divine artifice, designed specifically to combat powers deemed heretical, powers that resisted the Erd Tree's influence. This was not a flame of life or warmth, but one of death and decay, capable of burning away the very essence of a god, preventing their return. The black flame was entrusted to a mysterious figure, the gloam-eyed queen, a rival Empyrean whose origins are shrouded in enigma, but whose power was undeniable. She became the leader of the Godskin Apostles, fearsome warriors clad in the skin of vanquished gods, wielding the black flame with devastating precision. The gloam-eyed queen and her apostles were a force of nature, their black fire searing through anything that stood in their path, seemingly unstoppable. They were a terrifying manifestation of divine wrath, and for a time they served Marika's broader agenda, eliminating those who clung to older, forbidden forms of worship or power. However, Marika, in her relentless pursuit of absolute control, soon perceived the gloam-eyed queen not as an ally, but as a growing threat to the Golden Order's ultimate supremacy. An Empyrean, by definition, possessed the potential to become a god, and the gloam-eyed queen, with her mastery of the black flame and her devoted godskin apostles, represented an independent power base that Marika could not tolerate. The Golden Order was to be her order, and any rival claim to divine authority, even one she had initially sanctioned, had to be neutralized. The stage was set for a confrontation that would shape the very fabric of the lands between. Marika's shadow-bound beast, the formidable Malekith, also known as Gurunk, the beast clergyman, was tasked with the monumental undertaking of defeating the gloam-eyed queen and, crucially, sealing away the black flame. Malekith, bound to Marika by an unbreakable oath, was a being of immense power, and his duel with the gloam-eyed queen was a cataclysmic event, a clash of divine wills and primordial forces. The details of their battle are lost to time, but the outcome is clear. Malekith emerged victorious. He defeated the gloam-eyed queen, stripping her of her power and sealing the black flame within his own blade, the blade of destined death. This act was pivotal, for it not only removed a significant rival to Marika's authority, but also brought the terrifying power of the black flame under the Golden Order's indirect control, preventing its further use by independent factions. Yet even with such decisive victories, pockets of resistance, both overt and clandestine, persisted. Far from the Erdtree's blinding light, deep within the shadows of the lands between, the Shaman village, a community of ancient faith, secretly continued to commune with the flame of ruin. This primordial flame, a remnant of the pre-Erdtree era, represented a form of worship that directly defied Marika's Golden Order, which sought to extinguish all competing spiritual traditions. The shamans, guardians of ancient rites and forgotten lore, saw the flame of ruin not as a destructive force, but as a source of primordial power, a connection to the very genesis of the world. Their defiance was subtle, a quiet refusal to abandon their ancestral beliefs, but it was a defiance nonetheless, a crack in the seemingly unyielding facade of Marika's dominion. They understood the risks, the Golden Order's intolerance for any deviation from its doctrines, yet their faith remained unshaken, a testament to the enduring power of tradition in the face of overwhelming change. As Marika solidified her power, her lineage began to expand. Her children, the demigods, were born, each a testament to her divine authority and her union with Godfrey. Among them were Godwyn the Golden, her firstborn, a paragon of chivalry and grace, whose name would become synonymous with the Golden Order's early triumphs. Then came the twins, Morgott and Mog, born with the ominous omen of horns, a sign of their connection to the crucible, the primordial soup of life from which all things sprang. Their birth, while a source of immense power for Marika, also brought with it the inherent challenges of managing a family of demigods, each with their own ambitions and connections to different aspects of the world's ancient past. These children, imbued with a fraction of Marika's divine essence, were destined to play crucial roles in the unfolding drama of the lands between, their fates inextricably linked to the Golden Order's rise and eventual decline. With the fire giants subdued, the Glomide Queen defeated, and a powerful lineage established, the Golden Order consolidated its power across the lands between. Its doctrines, espousing the Erd Tree's divine grace as the sole source of prosperity and truth, were enforced with an iron fist. The Erd Tree's roots, ever expanding, spread throughout the land, absorbing the remnants of the Crucible's energies. This absorption was not merely a physical process, it was a spiritual annexation, a symbolic act of the Golden Order subsuming and repurposing the primordial forces of creation for its own ends. The Erd Tree became the central pillar of existence, its golden light illuminating every corner of the realm, its grace bestowed upon those deemed worthy, its laws enforced by the newly established institutions of the Golden Order. However, this consolidation came at a cost. The misbegotten, beings touched by the Crucible's primordial energies, often manifesting as beastly features or physical deformities, were now persecuted as abominations. Once seen as diverse forms of life, remnants of the world's ancient chaotic origins, they were now declared impure, their existence a blemish on the perfect tapestry of the Golden Order. They were hunted, enslaved, and ostracized, their connection to the Crucible, once a source of life, now a mark of shame. This systematic persecution revealed the darker side of Marika's Golden Order, its intolerance for anything that deviated from its rigid ideals of purity and order. The misbegotten became a symbol of the Golden Order's oppressive nature, their suffering a stark contrast to the radiant image of grace and prosperity it projected. In response to this growing persecution, the Shaman village, ever a sanctuary for the marginalized, opened its doors and sheltered outcasts, including those hunted by the Golden Order. Their ancient wisdom and their connection to the primordial flame of ruin made them uniquely empathetic to those rejected by the Erd Tree's light. They offered refuge, comfort, and a sense of belonging to those who had nowhere else to turn, their village becoming a hidden haven for the persecuted. This act of defiance, though quiet, was profound, demonstrating a fundamental difference in philosophy between the shamans and the Golden Order. While Marika sought to homogenize and control, the shamans embraced diversity and offered solace to the downtrodden, further cementing their role as a countercultural force within the lands between. Despite its outward strength, Marika's rule faced continuous challenges from outer gods and various factions clinging to old beliefs. The lands between were a vast and ancient realm, and the Golden Order, for all its power, was still a relatively new construct. Whispers of forbidden knowledge, echoes of forgotten deities, and the lingering influence of cosmic entities beyond the Erd Tree's reach continued to stir discontent and inspire resistance. These outer gods, with their alien designs and inscrutable motives, represented a constant, unseen threat to Marika's carefully constructed reality, their very existence a challenge to the Golden Order's claim of singular divine authority. Factions that revered these ancient powers, or simply refused to abandon their ancestral ways, continued to resist the Golden Order's assimilation, creating a constant undercurrent of tension and potential rebellion. In a final, audacious move to assert its absolute authority and to cement its control over life and death itself, the Golden Order declared the Erd Tree's blessings eternal, denying the natural cycle of death. This was perhaps Marika's most significant and far-reaching decree, a radical reshaping of existence itself. Death, in its natural form, was to be suppressed, its power sealed away, its inevitability denied. The destined death, the very concept of an ending, was to be removed from the equation, replaced by an eternal cycle of grace and rebirth under the Erd Tree's benevolent, yet ultimately controlling gaze. This declaration promised eternal life, an endless existence within the Erd Tree's embrace, but it also represented a profound manipulation of the natural order, a hubris that would, in time, have catastrophic consequences for the lands between. It was a promise of paradise, but one built upon the suppression of a fundamental aspect of life, a decision that would reverberate through the ages and ultimately lead to the shattering of the very order Marika had so painstakingly constructed. As the Golden Order solidified its grip on the lands between, its influence radiated outward, shaping not only the physical landscape, but also the very fabric of belief and destiny. It was in this era, the early Erd Tree era, often referred to as the Golden Order Dawn, that Godwyn the Golden, Marika's firstborn son, ascended to an almost mythical status. He became the living embodiment of the Golden Order's prosperity, a testament to its divine favor and the seemingly boundless blessings bestowed by the Erd Tree. Godwyn's triumphs, his radiant presence, and his unwavering loyalty to his mother and the Golden Order were meticulously woven into the tapestry of official history, serving as a powerful symbol of the New Age's glory. His image, often depicted alongside the burgeoning Erd Tree, was a constant reminder to the populace of the stability and abundance that the Golden Order promised, effectively cementing his role as a propaganda figurehead, a golden child in a golden age. This elevation of Godwyn, however, was not merely symbolic. It was a strategic move by Marika to further entrench the Golden Order's ideology, presenting a tangible, beloved figure for the common folk to rally behind, a champion whose very existence validated the new cosmic order. Concurrently, the Golden Order undertook a systematic campaign to suppress any dissenting ideologies or practices that challenged its absolute authority. Among these was the twin bird, a creature deeply intertwined with the death rite, an ancient belief system that acknowledged destined death as a natural and necessary part of the life cycle. The twin bird, with its dual nature representing life and death, was a stark contrast to the Golden Order's narrative of eternal life and the suppression of true death. Its imagery, once prevalent in funerary rites and spiritual practices, was systematically dismantled and replaced with symbols of the Erd Tree. This suppression was not merely a matter of theological disagreement. It was a fundamental assertion of control over destiny itself. By actively curtailing the death rite, the Golden Order sought to eliminate any notion of an inevitable end, projecting an image of perpetual existence under the Erd Tree's grace. This control over the narrative of life and death was crucial for maintaining the Golden Order's perceived omnipotence, as it presented itself as the sole arbiter of existence, capable of bestowing eternal life and withholding true death. The twin bird, therefore, became a symbol of a bygone era, its wings clipped by the encroaching golden light. Yet despite the Golden Order's pervasive influence, pockets of resistance and disillusionment began to form. The Shaman village, with its ancient traditions and reverence for the primordial crucible and the raw, untamed forces of nature, became a magnet for those who found the Golden Order's rigidity stifling. Its rituals, often involving communion with the spirits of the land and the manipulation of primal energies, offered an alternative spiritual path, a connection to something deeper and more ancient than the Erd Tree's grace. These were individuals who felt alienated by the Golden Order's increasingly dogmatic pronouncements, its insistence on a singular truth, and its systematic erasure of older beliefs. They sought solace in the Shaman village's embrace of the wild, the untamed, and the forgotten, drawn to its promise of a more holistic understanding of the cosmos, one that acknowledged the ebb and flow of life and death, creation and destruction, in a way the Golden Order vehemently denied. The village, nestled away from the gilded spires of the capital, became a clandestine sanctuary, a place where ancient wisdom was preserved and whispered among those who dared to question the dominant narrative. Even Marika, the very architect of the Golden Order, harbored secret doubts about its absolute nature. Beneath her regal exterior, a profound internal conflict simmered. She who had championed the Erd Tree and its golden tenets began to question the long term implications of its unyielding control over destiny. The suppression of destined death, the forced uniformity of belief, and the eradication of ancient traditions weighed heavily on her. These were not fleeting thoughts, but persistent inquiries that planted insidious seeds of doubt within her divine mind. She saw the cracks forming in the edifice she had so meticulously constructed, recognizing that a system built on absolute control and the denial of fundamental cosmic forces might ultimately be unsustainable. This burgeoning skepticism, carefully concealed from even her closest confidants, would prove to be a pivotal factor in the future unraveling of the Golden Order, as Marika herself, in her quiet moments of contemplation, began to envision a different path, a return to a more balanced existence that acknowledged the necessity of both life and death. The fire monks, once the revered guardians of the Flame of Ruin, an ancient and powerful force associated with the giants and their primordial forge, found themselves at a crossroads. In the early days of the Golden Order, their immense power and their connection to a destructive force posed a significant threat to Marika's burgeoning empire. Rather than outright extermination, which would have been a costly and potentially destabilizing endeavor, the Golden Order chose a more insidious path: co-option. The fire monks were, through a combination of diplomatic overtures, strategic alliances, and perhaps even subtle coercion, integrated into the Golden Order's hierarchy. Their formidable pyromancy was repurposed, their devotion redirected, and their ancient traditions recontextualized to serve the new regime. They were tasked with guarding the remnants of the Flame of Ruin, not to worship it, but to contain it, to ensure it never again threatened the Erd Tree. This was a masterful stroke of political maneuvering, transforming a potential enemy into a subservient, albeit powerful asset. Their fiery devotion now channeled towards the preservation of the Golden Order rather than its destruction. However, not all fire monks succumbed to the Golden Order's embrace. A dedicated faction, deeply rooted in their ancient traditions and loyal to the primordial Flame of Ruin, resisted the co-option. They viewed the Golden Order's actions as a sacrilege, a perversion of their sacred duty. These renegade fire monks, operating in absolute secrecy, maintained their allegiance to the shamans, recognizing a shared reverence for ancient powers and a mutual distrust of the Golden Order's absolute authority. They became clandestine allies, their fiery knowledge and their understanding of primordial forces providing a valuable counterpoint to the Erdtree's golden grace. Their existence, a hidden ember in the vast golden empire, represented a simmering defiance, a testament to the enduring power of ancient beliefs, even in the face of overwhelming opposition. They understood that the Flame of Ruin, though contained, still held immense power, a power that could one day be rekindled to challenge the Erdtree's dominance. As the Golden Order's influence expanded, its persecution of dissenting groups intensified. The Shaman village, with its open embrace of ancient rituals and its growing community of disillusioned individuals, became a prime target. The Golden Order, in its relentless pursuit of absolute uniformity, viewed the shamans as a dangerous anomaly, a direct challenge to its theological and political hegemony. This persecution, which began with subtle pressures and veiled threats, escalated into direct suppression, forcing the shaman village deeper and deeper into hiding. They retreated into the most remote and inaccessible regions of the lands between, their homes becoming hidden enclaves, their rituals performed in secret, their knowledge passed down through hushed whispers. This forced isolation, while protecting them from outright annihilation, also served to further entrench their unique identity and their commitment to preserving the ancient ways, forging a stronger sense of community and resistance in the face of adversity. The Golden Order, in its attempt to eradicate them, inadvertently strengthened their resolve and solidified their role as custodians of forgotten truths. Even as the Golden Order seemingly triumphed, the legacy of the Dusk Eyed Queen, the enigmatic leader of the Godskin Apostles and wielder of destined death, continued to cast a long shadow. Though she had been defeated and destined death sealed away, her memory lingered, a potent symbol of defiance against the Erd Tree's dominion. Her story, whispered in hushed tones among the disaffected, inspired underground resistance movements. These were not organized armies, but fragmented cells of individuals who believed in the necessity of destined death, who saw the Golden Order's suppression of it as an unnatural perversion. They drew strengths from the dusk-eyed queen's courage, her willingness to challenge the divine, and her understanding of the cosmic balance. Her legacy became a rallying cry for those who yearned for a return to a natural order, a world where life and death flowed in harmony, unhindered by the Erd Tree's golden chains. These nascent resistance movements, though small and scattered, represented a persistent threat to the Golden Order's seemingly unshakable authority. It was in this context of burgeoning dissent and the lingering threat of destined death that Marika made a pivotal decision. She entrusted her shadow, Malekith, the Black Blade, with the sacred duty of becoming the keeper of destined death. This was not a punitive measure, but a strategic one, born of Marika's growing understanding of the cosmic balance. Malekith, bound by an unbreakable oath, was tasked with ensuring its containment, preventing its release into the lands between. He became a living prison for the very force that could unravel the Golden Order, a fearsome guardian whose very existence underscored the immense power of what he contained. This act, while seemingly reinforcing the Golden Order's control over death, also revealed Marika's underlying anxiety about its potential resurgence. It was a tacit acknowledgement that destined death, though suppressed, remained an intrinsic and powerful force, one that could not be simply wished away, but had to be actively managed and contained by a being of immense power and unwavering loyalty. Malekith's burden was immense, his solitary vigil a testament to the ever-present threat of oblivion. Within the hidden enclaves of the Shaman village, the elders, custodians of ancient prophecies and primordial wisdom, began to foretell a momentous event. They spoke of the return of the flame of ruin, not as a destructive force to be feared, but as a necessary catalyst, a primordial fire that would challenge the Erd Tree's absolute dominance. Their prophecies, passed down through generations, spoke of a time when the golden light would dim and the ancient flames would rise once more to restore balance to the lands between. They understood that the Erd Tree's artificial immortality was unsustainable, and that the natural cycle of creation and destruction, of life and death, would eventually reassert itself. These prophecies served as a beacon of hope for those who resisted the Golden Order, a promise that the current era of golden dominance was not eternal, and that a new age, perhaps one more aligned with the ancient ways, was on the horizon. The shamans, through their deep connection to the land and its primordial energies, foresaw the inevitable clash between the golden light and the ancient flame, a conflict that would redefine the very nature of the lands between. On the surface, the Golden Order's dominance appeared unshakable, its golden boughs spread across the lands between, its institutions firmly established, its ideology seemingly ingrained in the hearts and minds of its subjects. The Erd Tree stood as a towering symbol of its power, its golden light illuminating every corner of the realm. Yet beneath this veneer of absolute control, dissent simmered. The whispers of the shaman village, the clandestine activities of the renegade fire monks, the lingering legacy of the dusk-eyed queen, and the quiet doubts of Marika herself all contributed to an underlying current of unrest. The Golden Order, in its relentless pursuit of uniformity, had inadvertently created the very conditions for its eventual challenge. The seeds of rebellion were sown in the fertile ground of suppressed beliefs and unacknowledged truths, waiting for the opportune moment to sprout and blossom into open defiance. Marika's internal conflict, once a secret burden, grew increasingly profound. She, the divine ruler, found herself caught between her sacred duty to uphold the Golden Order and her burgeoning skepticism about its long-term viability. She wrestled with the implications of her own creation, questioning whether the path she had forged was truly the best for the lands between. This internal struggle, a silent war waged within her divine consciousness, was a testament to her complex nature, her capacity for both unwavering conviction and profound self-doubt. She understood the immense power she wielded, but also the immense responsibility that came with it. As she balanced her divine duty with her burgeoning skepticism, Marika began to contemplate radical changes, perhaps even a dismantling of the very order she had so meticulously constructed. Her internal turmoil, though hidden from the world, would ultimately be the catalyst for the seismic shifts that would redefine the lands between, setting in motion a chain of events that would lead to the shattering of the Elden Ring and the dawn of a new, fractured era. The Golden Age, for all its apparent glory, was already beginning to show its first, almost imperceptible cracks. As the Golden Order solidified its dominion under Queen Marika, an era of relative stability, albeit one built on conquest and suppression, settled across the lands between. However, this fragile peace was destined to shatter, quite literally, with an event that would plunge the entire realm into an age of unprecedented chaos. We now transition to the third major epic in our timeline, the shattering and the village's isolation, a period unfolding during the shattering itself, a time we've termed the Chaos Era. The cataclysm began with Marika herself. In a moment of profound grief, or perhaps an ultimate act of defiance against the very order she had championed, Queen Marika shattered the Elden Ring. This wasn't merely a symbolic gesture, it was a physical fracturing of the fundamental laws of the world, the very source of the Erd Tree's grace and the Golden Order's power. The reasons for her drastic action remain shrouded in mystery, debated by scholars and madmen alike. Was it sorrow over the loss of Godwyn, her firstborn, to destined death? Was it a rebellion against the greater will, the outer god that had chosen her as its vessel? Or was it a desperate attempt to break free from a predetermined fate, to carve a new path for the lands between? Whatever her motivation, the consequences were immediate and catastrophic. The golden runes, the very essence of the Elden Ring, scattered across the land, each imbued with immense power. This fracturing triggered immediate chaos across the lands between. The divine order, once absolute and unyielding, fractured along with the ring. The demigods, Marika's offspring and adopted children, each inherited fragments of the shattered Elden Ring, known as Great Runes. Driven by ambition, grief, or a distorted sense of duty, they scrambled for power, each believing themselves destined to become the next Elden Lord. Rykard, General Radon, Millennia, Morgott, Mohg, and Godric, among others, plunged the realm into a brutal civil war. Factions loyal to different demigods clashed, tearing apart the fabric of society. The once unified Golden Order splintered into warring ideological camps, each interpreting Marika's actions and the will of the greater will in their own self-serving ways. Entire regions were devastated, their populations decimated by the ceaseless conflict. The beautiful, if oppressive, Golden Age gave way to an age of blood and fire, where the very concept of grace seemed to abandon the land. Amidst this burgeoning pandemonium, the shaman village, nestled deep within a hidden valley of the Altus Plateau, sensed the coming conflict. Their connection to the spirits of the land, though diminished by the Golden Order's influence, was still strong enough to perceive the tremors of cosmic upheaval. The village elders, wise in the ways of ancient prophecy and attuned to the subtle shifts in the flow of spiritual energy, recognized the imminent danger. They understood that the wars of the demigods would spare no one, and their secluded haven, though naturally protected, would eventually be discovered if left vulnerable. Thus, a decision was made, a drastic measure to ensure the survival of their unique culture and their ancestral practices. They would seal their borders. This wasn't merely a physical blockade, it was a spiritual withdrawal, a conscious act of separation from the wider world. To further safeguard their isolation, the village elders invoked ancient wards. These wards, rituals passed down through generations, were designed to obscure the village's location from outsiders, both mundane and magical. They wove intricate spells of illusion and misdirection, drawing upon the natural energies of the plateau itself. Mists would coalesce and dissipate erratically, paths would shift and vanish, and the very air would carry a subtle disorientation, guiding unwelcome travelers away from the valley's entrance. These wards were not aggressive in nature, they were defensive, designed to deter rather than destroy, to foster oblivion rather than confrontation. They sought to render their village invisible, a forgotten corner of the lands between where the madness of the shattering could not penetrate. Concurrently with the sealing of their borders, the shamans made a profound and symbolic break. They abandoned all contact with the Golden Order. This wasn't a sudden, violent rebellion, but a calculated severance of ties. For centuries, the Golden Order had sought to assimilate or suppress the shamanistic traditions, viewing them as pagan idolatry or dangerous heresy. While the village had largely maintained its autonomy due to its isolation, there had always been a tenuous, often hostile relationship. Now, with the Golden Order in disarray, the shamans saw their opportunity to reclaim their spiritual independence. They formally severed ties with the Erd Tree's grace, rejecting its tenets and its promise of divine guidance. This meant foregoing the blessings and protection that the Erd Tree nominally offered, but it also meant freedom from its oppressive dogma. It was a declaration of spiritual sovereignty, a return to their pre-Erd Tree roots. It was in this period of self-imposed isolation that a curious development occurred. A group of exiled confessors, branded heretics by the crumbling Golden Order for practicing blood incantations, sought refuge in the village. These confessors, once part of the Golden Order's intelligence and enforcement arm, had delved into forbidden arts, harnessing the power of blood to cast potent, often gruesome spells. Their practices, deemed anathema to the purity of the Erd Tree, led to their excommunication and persecution. Fleeing persecution, and drawn by the nascent rumors of a place where the Golden Order's writ did not run, they stumbled upon the Veiled Valley. Though their magic was foreign and often disturbing to the shamans, the village, having just rejected the Golden Order itself, was surprisingly receptive. The shamans, ever pragmatic, recognized that these exiles possessed knowledge and power that could be valuable in their increasingly dangerous world, even if their methods were unconventional. Their shared enemy, the Golden Order, forged an unlikely alliance. The village's high shaman, Eldri the Unseen, a figure of immense spiritual power and pragmatic wisdom, formally declared neutrality in the coming wars. This wasn't a passive stance, but an active commitment to non-intervention. Eldri understood that aligning with any of the warring demigods would inevitably lead to the village's destruction. Their strength lay in their unity and their unique spiritual connection to the land, not in martial prowess against the overwhelming forces of the demigods. Eldri's declaration was a strategic imperative designed to preserve the village and its ancestral knowledge. It meant refusing aid or allegiance to any faction, even those who might seem to share common ground. Their fight was for survival, not for dominion. To further solidify this neutrality and erase any potential pretexts for intervention, Eldri ordered the destruction of all records linking the village to Marika's early reign. These records, carefully preserved over centuries, detailed the initial interactions between the nascent Golden Order and the shamanic traditions, including instances of forced conversion, uneasy alliances, and the gradual suppression of their practices. Eldri understood that these historical documents, however invaluable to their own understanding of their past, could be used as leverage or justification for invasion by the demigods, particularly those who still sought to uphold the Golden Order's legacy. It was a painful decision, a sacrifice of historical memory for the sake of future survival, but one Eldri deemed necessary. The past, in this tumultuous era, was a dangerous burden. However, not all in the village agreed with Eldri's isolationist and neutral stance. A faction of younger shamans, led by the fiery and idealistic Kale the Dissenter, argued vehemently for aiding the oppressed against the Golden Order. Kale and his followers saw the shattering not just as a threat, but as an opportunity. They believed that the Golden Order, now weakened and fractured, could be overthrown entirely, and a new, more equitable order, one that respected the ancient traditions, could be established. They felt a moral obligation to intervene, to use their spiritual gifts to protect the innocent and to fight against the remnants of the oppressive regime. Kale often spoke of the suffering of the common folk, the endless cycles of war and exploitation, and argued that true neutrality in such times was tantamount to complicity. His impassioned speeches resonated with many of the younger generation, who felt stifled by the elders' cautious approach. Meanwhile, the village's blacksmith, Goran, a master craftsman whose skills were renowned even beyond the hidden valley, began to forge weapons imbued with ancestral spirit ashes instead of holy infusions. For generations, the village's smiths had been forced, under the Golden Order's influence, to incorporate holy elements into their craft, a symbolic act of submission. Now, with the Golden Order's power waning, Goran reverted to the ancient ways. He learned to commune with the spirits of their ancestors, drawing upon their lingering essences to imbue steel with a different kind of power. These weapons glowed with an ethereal, pale light, not the brilliant gold of Erd-tree grace, but the shimmering blue of spiritual energy. They were designed not for holy crusades, but for the practical defense of the village, their power rooted in the very land and its history, a stark contrast to the divine blessings of the Golden Order. It was during this period of intense internal debate and external vigilance that a lone tarnished, rejected by grace, stumbled upon the village but was turned away at spear point. This tarnished, like countless others, roamed the lands between, seeking purpose and power in the wake of the shattering. Driven by a vague sense of destiny or simply desperate survival, they had somehow breached the outer layers of the village's wards. However, the village's defenses were not yet absolute, and its inhabitants were wary. The tarnished, though seemingly harmless, represented the very chaos they sought to avoid. The High Shaman's decree of neutrality was absolute, and any interaction with outsiders, even a lone wanderer, was deemed a potential breach of their carefully constructed isolation. The encounter was brief, a tense standoff where the tarnished was made to understand, through stern glares and the glint of ancestral imbued spears, that this was not a place of refuge for the world's outcasts. Despite the village's best efforts to remain hidden, rumors began to spread among the outcasts and disenfranchised of the lands between. Whispers of a heretic's haven, where Golden Order laws did not apply, started to circulate, carried by desperate travelers and those who had glimpsed the veiled valley. These rumors were fueled by the tales of the exiled confessors who had found refuge there, and by the sheer desperation of a populace yearning for a place free from the tyranny of the warring demigods. The village, despite its desire for complete anonymity, was slowly becoming a legend, a beacon of defiance for those who had been cast aside by the shattered world. These whispers, though often exaggerated, hinted at a place where ancient ways persisted, where different forms of magic were practiced, and where the oppressive hand of the Golden Order had no sway. Perhaps the most significant internal development during this period of isolation was the rediscovery of the Elder Tongue by the village's spirit callers. This ancient language, predating the rise of the Erd Tree and the Golden Order, was a means of direct communion with spirits, not through the intermediaries of grace or divine blessings, but through a deep, intrinsic understanding of their essences. For centuries, the Elder Tongue had been suppressed, its knowledge fading into obscurity under the Golden Order's relentless campaign to eradicate pagan practices. Now, with the Golden Order in disarray and the shamans fully embracing their ancestral heritage, the spirit callers, guided by Eldri the Unseen and fueled by a renewed sense of purpose, painstakingly pieced together fragments of the language from ancient scrolls and forgotten oral traditions. The rediscovery of the Elder Tongue represented a profound spiritual rebirth for the village, a reestablishment of their direct link to the spiritual world, unmediated by any external deity or power. It was a powerful statement of their independence, a return to the very core of their identity, and a crucial step in preparing them for the uncertain future that lay ahead. This ancient tongue, once a whisper in the wind, was now a resonant voice, ready to speak with the very fabric of the lands between. As the fabric of the lands between tore itself asunder, the isolated shaman village too felt the tremors of the shattering. While the demigods waged war, Eldri, the village's enigmatic leader, pursued a clandestine agenda. He began to secretly communicate with the Deathbirds, those ancient, spectral guardians of the Helfen, a realm beyond the Erd Tree's golden embrace. These communications were not mere exchanges of pleasantries, but rather a deep dive into forbidden knowledge. Eldri, through his unique attunement to the spiritual world, learned of destined death's suppressed power, a force that Marika herself had sealed away with the rune of death. The Deathbirds, remnants of a time before the Golden Order, harbored memories of an age when death was a natural cycle, not a controlled phenomenon. Eldri sought to understand how this primordial aspect of existence could be reawakened, believing it held the key to true liberation from the Erd Tree's suffocating influence. He saw in destined death not an end, but a transformative power, a force that could cleanse the rot and decay that had begun to fester in the lands between, even within the village itself. His conversations with the Deathbirds were fraught with peril, for probing the secrets of destined death was to dance on the precipice of madness and heresy. He had to be careful, for even within the village, there were those who would recoil from such dark wisdom. The chaos of the shattering also brought unexpected visitors to the village's doorstep. A group of nomadic merchants, their caravans laden with exotic wares and their faces etched with fear, arrived seeking sanctuary. They had been mercilessly purged from Landell, the royal capital, by the Golden Order's zealous forces, who saw their foreign customs and independent trade as a threat to their rigid dogma. These merchants, known for their distinctive blue cloaks and their deep knowledge of forgotten trade routes, were granted refuge in the village's outer ruins, a testament to the shaman's enduring compassion, even in a time of great strife. The ruins, once a bustling outpost of an older civilization, offered a measure of shelter, though they were far from pristine. The shamans understood that these merchants, though outsiders, were victims of the same oppressive forces that sought to control all life in the lands between. Their arrival, however, was not without its complications. They brought with them not only their goods, but also whispers of the outside world, tales of unimaginable destruction, and the escalating madness of the demigods. Their presence also stretched the village's already strained resources, a subtle pressure that would contribute to the growing internal tensions. Within the village, a faction led by Kyle, a shaman known for his fervent devotion to ancient traditions, began to chafe under Eldry's increasingly esoteric pursuits. Kyle and his followers, yearning for a return to what they perceived as the village's true, uncorrupted roots, performed forbidden communion with the spirit of the ancient crucible. The crucible, a primordial soup of life from which all things were said to have sprung, was a powerful, untamed force. To commune with its spirit was to tap into raw, unfiltered creation, a dangerous endeavor that often resulted in physical mutations and spiritual corruption. Kale's faction believed that by embracing the crucible's power, they could restore the village's vitality and assert its independence from the fading Erd Tree. This act, however, drew Eldry's immediate and fierce ire. He saw it as a reckless transgression, a desperate grasp at power that threatened to unleash uncontrolled chaos upon their already fragile community. Eldry, who understood the delicate balance of spiritual forces, knew the crucible's power was not to be trifled with, especially not in such a desperate time. He saw Kale's actions as a betrayal of their shared spiritual principles, a dangerous deviation from the path of careful, measured spiritual mastery. Indeed, the village's reliance on the Erd Tree's grace was becoming painfully evident. The crops, once lush and bountiful, began to fail, their leaves wilting and their fruits shriveling. The Erd Tree's blessing, once a constant, unwavering source of life, was fading, its golden light dimming as the shattering raged. In response, the shamans, ever resourceful, turned to spirit-infused agriculture. They began to channel the life force of benevolent spirits into the barren soil, coaxing new growth from the dying earth. This practice, while effective in the short term, was labor-intensive and required immense spiritual focus, further straining the shaman's already dwindling reserves. It was a stark reminder of their growing isolation and their desperate struggle for survival. The fading of the Erd Tree's blessing was not just an agricultural crisis, it was a spiritual crisis, a sign that the very foundation of their world was crumbling. The shamans, through their spirit-infused agriculture, were not just growing food, they were actively resisting the encroaching decay, a daily act of defiance against the encroaching blight. The village's precarious existence was further threatened when Golden Order zealots, fanatical warriors clad in gleaming armor and wielding incantations of holy fire, attempted to raid the village. Driven by their unwavering belief in the Erd Tree's supremacy and their mission to purge all perceived heresies, they sought to eradicate the shamanic practices they deemed anathema. However, they were met with fierce resistance, and the shamans, utilizing their unique connection to the spirit world, conjured spectral warriors, ethereal figures of ancestors, and nature spirits who rose from the earth to defend their sacred home. These spectral guardians, wielding ghostly blades and ethereal shields, were invisible to the zealots' physical eyes, striking from unexpected angles and sowing terror in their ranks. The raid was repelled, but not without casualties, and it served as a grim reminder of the constant threat they faced from the outside world. This skirmish, though successful for the village, further solidified their identity as outcasts, as enemies of the established order. The spectral warriors, though powerful, were a manifestation of the village's desperation, a reliance on ancient powers to defend against modern threats. In the aftermath of the raid, Eldry, His patience with Kale's transgressions exhausted, delivered a brutal punishment. He burned Kale's crucible-touched arm, the limb that had dared to commune with the ancient power, with a searing spiritual fire. This was not a physical burning, but a spiritual one, a searing of the soul that left Kale's arm withered and useless, a constant reminder of his defiance. This act of severe discipline, meant to reassert Eldry's authority and to curb Kyle's dangerous ambitions, only deepened the factional rift within the village. Kyle, now disfigured and humiliated, retreated further into the shadows, his resentment festering. The burning of his arm was a public spectacle, a declaration of Eldry's unwavering resolve, but it also sowed seeds of fear and division among the villagers, forcing them to choose sides, even if subtly. This act, meant to unify, instead splintered the community further, creating an unbridgeable chasm between Eldraz's measured approach and Kael's radical fervor. Amidst the growing internal strife and external threats, the village's seers, those with the keenest spiritual sight, began to report unsettling visions. They spoke of a veiled lord moving in the shadows, a figure of immense power and mystery, operating beyond the purview of the warring demigods. These visions, fragmented and cryptic, hinted at a hidden hand at play, a force manipulating events from behind the scenes. Later, this veiled lord would be revealed as Michaela, the Empyrean, brother to Millennia, who, in his desperate attempt to cure his sister's scarlet rot and to create a world free from the outer god's influence, had embarked on his own clandestine quest. The seer's visions, though initially perplexing, were a testament to their profound connection to the spiritual currents of the lands between, allowing them to perceive events that remained hidden from even the most powerful of the demigods. These visions, though unsettling, also offered a glimmer of hope, a suggestion that there were still forces at play beyond the destructive cycle of the shattering. In response to the escalating threats and the need for more potent defenses, the shamans perfected the Ashcry incantation. This powerful spell weaponized the voices of dead spirits, transforming their mournful wails and desperate pleas into a devastating sonic assault. When unleashed, the Ashcry would disorient, terrify, and even physically harm invaders, their very souls assaulted by the echoes of the deceased. This incantation was a testament to the shaman's mastery over the spirit world, their ability to harness the ethereal for practical, even violent purposes. It was a grim but effective weapon, born of desperation and the need to protect their dwindling community. The Ash Cry was more than just a spell. It was a spiritual weapon, a manifestation of the village's collective grief and defiance, turning the sorrow of the past into a shield against the present. Its development marked a shift in the village's defensive strategy, moving from passive resistance to active, aggressive protection. During this tumultuous period, a significant discovery was made in the village catacombs, a labyrinthine network of ancient burial chambers beneath the settlement. A stash of discarded amber starlight shards was found, glimmering faintly in the perpetual gloom. These shards, remnants of fallen stars, were highly prized for their connection to the cosmos and their perceived magical properties. Their presence in the catacombs hinted at a forgotten past, a time when the village, or perhaps an earlier civilization that occupied the site, engaged in celestial worship, venerating the stars and their cosmic influence. This discovery was a profound revelation, suggesting a deeper, more ancient spiritual lineage for the village than previously understood. It raised questions about the origins of their shamanic practices and their connection to the broader cosmic order, predating even the Erdtree's dominion. The amber starlight shards were not just artifacts, they were echoes of a forgotten faith, a silent testament to a time when the heavens held a different kind of power, The fragile balance within the village was irrevocably shattered when Eldry died under mysterious circumstances. His passing was sudden, unexpected, and fueled immediate suspicion. While no definitive proof emerged, whispers of Kael's involvement spread like wildfire through the community. The animosity between the two leaders had been palpable, and Kael's resentment over his withered arm was well known. Some believed Kael, driven by ambition and a thirst for power, had orchestrated Eldra's demise, seeing it as an opportunity to seize control and implement his radical vision. Others suspected a more subtle spiritual attack, a curse or a dark ritual unleashed by Kael's faction. Eldra's death, regardless of its true cause, plunged the village into a state of uncertainty and fear, marking the end of an era and the beginning of a new, more volatile chapter. His death was not just the loss of a leader, it was the loss of a moderating force, a spiritual anchor that had kept the village from fully succumbing to extremism. With Eldry gone, Kael swiftly assumed leadership, consolidating his power and openly declaring the village a sanctuary for enemies of the Golden Order. This was a bold and defiant move, a clear statement of their secession from the established powers of the lands between. Kael, no longer constrained by Eldry's cautious approach, embraced a more aggressive and confrontational stance. He welcomed all who opposed the Erdtree's dogma, regardless of their past allegiances or their methods. This declaration transformed the village from a secluded haven into a beacon of rebellion, attracting a diverse array of malcontents, exiles, and those who simply sought refuge from the Golden Order's tyranny. The village, under Kael's leadership, became a hub for dissent, a place where forbidden knowledge and unconventional practices could flourish without fear of persecution. This open declaration of defiance was a turning point, solidifying the village's identity as a bastion against the oppressive forces of the lands between. Under Kael's directorship, the village began training Duskblades, a new order of warriors who blended traditional swordplay with ancestral spirit summoning. These elite fighters were taught to channel the power of their ancestors, weaving spectral attacks into their physical combat. They moved with a fluidity that blurred the line between the living and the dead, their blades imbued with the ethereal strength of spirits. The Duskblades were not merely soldiers. They were spiritual warriors, embodying the village's unique blend of martial prowess and spiritual mastery. Their training was rigorous, demanding not only physical discipline, but also a deep connection to the ancestral spirits. They were the spearhead of Kael's new, more aggressive defense, a visible manifestation of the village's transformation into a formidable, self-sufficient entity. The creation of the Duskblades was a strategic move, a way to leverage the village's spiritual strengths into a tangible military force capable of defending against the increasingly powerful external threats. Among the many who sought refuge in the newly declared sanctuary was Roderica, a fugitive spirit tuner. She arrived at the village, distraught and alone, after her entire group had been slaughtered by recusants, those who had abandoned the Erdtree's grace to serve the blasphemous Lord Rykard at Volcano Manor. Roderica, with her innate ability to commune with and enhance the spirits of the deceased, was a valuable asset to the village, even in her grief. Her arrival brought with it not only her unique skills, but also a first-hand account of the horrors perpetrated by the recusants, further solidifying the village's resolve against all forms of tyranny. Roderica's presence was a testament to the village's growing reputation as a haven for the disenfranchised and the persecuted, a place where even the most broken souls could find a measure of peace and purpose. Her story, though tragic, also offered valuable intelligence about the fragmented and warring factions of the lands between, insights that would prove crucial in the village's ongoing struggle for survival. In the shadowed heart of the shattering, as the very fabric of the lands between tore asunder. The village's already precarious existence was further jeopardized by internal strife and external threats. It was during this tumultuous period, marked by the echoes of Marika's shattering and the ensuing chaos, that Kale, ever the pragmatist and driven by a desperate desire to protect his people, forged a perilous pact. He sought out the godskin apostates, those grotesque figures draped in the flayed skin of their victims, who wielded the dreaded black flame. Kyle, recognizing their formidable power and their inherent connection to a primal destructive force, offered them something of immense value: the ancient spirit calling knowledge passed down through generations of his village. This was not merely the ability to summon spectral allies, but a nuanced understanding of the veil between life and death, a mastery over the ethereal energies that bound spirits to the mortal coil. In exchange, the Godskins, always eager to spread their nihilistic gospel and increase their destructive capabilities, granted Kale fragments of the black flame. These were not merely embers, but potent, unstable essences, raw manifestations of the destructive power once wielded by the gloam-eyed queen herself. Kyle's intention was to harness this power, to turn it against the encroaching threats. But in doing so, he invited a far more insidious darkness into the heart of his community. The consequences of Kale's desperate gamble were swift and devastating. An experiment born of a misguided attempt to integrate the Black Flame's destructive properties with the village's existing spiritual practices went horribly awry. Kyle, perhaps seeking to understand the nature of death itself, attempted to imbue Deathroot with the Black Flame's essence, believing he could control its blighting power. Instead, the volatile energies reacted unpredictably, creating a virulent, localized blight that spread with terrifying speed. A significant portion of the village, particularly its southern residential quarter, became tainted. The Deathroot, now infused with a corrupted form of the Black Flame, didn't merely kill. It twisted and warped, transforming the very essence of the land and its inhabitants. Those exposed to it suffered agonizing transformations, their bodies twisting into grotesque forms, their minds consumed by a primal, unthinking rage. To prevent the blight's spread, the villagers, in a desperate act of self-preservation, erected formidable thorn barriers woven from the mutated flora that now thrived in the blighted quarter. This section of the village became a quarantined zone, a horrifying testament to Kyle's ambition and the unpredictable nature of the forces he sought to control. The cries of the afflicted, forever trapped behind the thorny walls, served as a constant chilling reminder of the price of meddling with powers beyond mortal comprehension. Amidst this burgeoning despair, a flicker of ancient knowledge was rekindled. The village's Moonreader sect, a reclusive order dedicated to deciphering celestial omens and charting the cosmic dance, made a profound discovery. While sifting through crumbling archives and forgotten alcoves within their sacred observatory, they unearthed fragments of ancient astrolabes. These were not mere navigational tools, but intricately designed instruments, far more advanced than anything known in the current age. Through painstaking reconstruction and deciphering of the accompanying arcane texts, the Moonreaders rediscovered a direct link between their celestial rites and the primeval current. This was the primordial source of all sorcery, the very wellspring of cosmic energy that flowed through the stars and influenced the fate of the lands between. The astrolabes, when properly aligned, allowed them to tap into this ancient power, to draw upon its vast energies, and to perceive the intricate interwoven tapestry of fate. This rediscovery offered a glimmer of hope, a potential path to understanding, and perhaps even mitigating the chaos that now engulfed their world, though its full implications were yet to be understood. However, this fragile hope was brutally extinguished. Kael, the architect of both their salvation and their suffering, was assassinated. The perpetrator was a confessor, a member of the Golden Order's zealous clergy, who had infiltrated the village under the guise of a refugee fleeing the rampant wars of the Shattering. This confessor, driven by a fanatical belief in the purity of the Golden Order and seeing Kale's pact with the Godskins as an unforgivable heresy, struck with swift and merciless precision. Kyle, already burdened by the weight of his decisions and perhaps weakened by the lingering effects of his black flame experiments, offered little resistance. His death plunged the village into an even deeper abyss of paranoia and suspicion. Trust, already a scarce commodity, evaporated entirely. Every stranger, every whispered conversation, every shadowed figure became a potential threat. The unity that had once defined their community fractured further as accusations and fear festered in the wake of Kale's demise. The confessor, having completed their grim mission, vanished into the chaos of the Shattering, leaving behind a legacy of fear and further division. In the immediate aftermath of Kale's assassination and the escalating blight, Roderica, a young but remarkably resilient spirit tuner, stepped forward. Possessing an innate connection to the spirits and a profound understanding of their ethereal energies, she rallied a desperate purification rite. Drawing upon ancient shamanistic practices and an intuitive grasp of the delicate balance between life and death, Roderica gathered the strongest spirit embers, fragments of pure spiritual energy that resonated with the Golden Order's grace. These were not the corrupted black flame fragments, but rather the benevolent, life-affirming embers that permeated the land. Through a arduous and dangerous ritual, she directed these golden spirit embers into the blighted quarter. For a time, the Deathroot blight was temporarily quelled. The rampant growth receded, the grotesque transformation slowed, and the tormented cries softened to a dull moan. This was not a cure, but a powerful palliative, a temporary reprieve that bought the villagers precious time and offered a fleeting glimpse of hope. Roderica's act of courage and compassion cemented her as a leader, a beacon of moderation in an increasingly radicalized community. Despite Roderica's heroic efforts, the village remained deeply divided. The temporary respite provided by her purification rite was not enough to bridge the ideological chasm that had opened between its inhabitants. The village effectively split into two distinct factions. One half, drawn to Roderica's pragmatic and compassionate approach, sought to maintain a semblance of their traditional ways, emphasizing spiritual harmony and a cautious engagement with the outside world. They believed in the power of their ancestral rites and the inherent goodness of their spirits. The other half, however, disillusioned by Kale's failures and the ever-present threat of the Shattering, embraced the nihilistic philosophy of the Godskins. They saw the world as inherently corrupt, destined for destruction, and believed that only by embracing the destructive power of the Black Flame could they truly survive. This faction, swayed by the siren song of absolute power and the promise of a swift end to their suffering, began to actively seek out and emulate the Godskins, adopting their grim aesthetics and their ruthless methods. The once unified village was now a house divided, teetering on the brink of open conflict. Adding another layer of complexity to the village's already strained existence, a band of misbegotten, those unfortunate beings born of humans and beasts, found refuge in the village's lower caves. These particular misbegotten were unique, bearing undeniable traces of Radagon's red hair, a genetic anomaly that hinted at a deeper, more profound connection to the fractured lineage of the Golden Order. They were not merely beastmen, but creatures touched by the very essence of the Elden Ring's former consort, carrying within them a fragmented echo of his power and his sorrow. Shunned by the outside world and hunted relentlessly, they sought sanctuary in the hidden depths beneath the village. While their presence was initially met with suspicion, Roderica's faction, guided by her compassionate nature, extended a cautious welcome, offering them shelter in exchange for their assistance in foraging and defense. The nihilist faction, however, viewed them with disdain and fear, seeing them as further proof of the world's decay and a potential threat to their burgeoning power. The presence of these Radagon touched misbegotten further complicated the internal dynamics of the village, adding a new element of tension and a potential flashpoint for conflict. The Nihilist faction, emboldened by their growing numbers and their increasingly radical ideology, took a daring and dangerous step. Hearing whispers of a passing Godskin caravan laden with spoils from their merciless campaigns, they launched a covert operation. Their target? A fragment of the Rune of Death. This was not merely a symbolic relic, but a tangible piece of the very concept of death, a sliver of the power once held by Malekith, the Black Blade. The Godskins, in their relentless pursuit of destruction, often carried such fragments, using them to fuel their black flame and to further their nihilistic agenda. The Nihilist faction, through a combination of stealth and brute force, successfully ambushed the caravan, overpowering its guards and absconding with a small but incredibly potent fragment of the Rune of Death. This act was a clear declaration of their intent, a definitive break from the village's traditional ways, and a direct challenge to Roderica's authority. With this fragment in their possession, they believed they held the key to ultimate power, the ability to control death itself, and to usher in the era of destruction they so desperately craved. In response to the Nihilist faction's audacious theft and their increasingly aggressive posturing, Roderica's faction took decisive action to prevent open civil war. Recognizing that direct confrontation would only lead to further bloodshed and the complete annihilation of their community, they erected a palisade, a formidable defensive wall that effectively divided the village in two. This was not merely a physical barrier, but a symbolic one, a stark representation of the ideological chasm that now separated the two factions. The palisade, constructed from reinforced timber and imbued with protective spiritual wards, served as a clear demarcation line, preventing direct skirmishes and allowing each faction to govern their respective territories. While it prevented immediate large-scale conflict, it also solidified the division, transforming the once unified village into two distinct, often hostile enclaves. The constant presence of the palisade served as a grim reminder of their fractured community, a testament to the devastating impact of the shattering and the internal strife it had wrought. As if the internal strife and external pressures weren't enough, a chilling omen appeared above the village. The last known deathbird was sighted, perched ominously on the highest peak overlooking their divided community. These ancient, grotesque creatures, harbingers of death and decay, were rarely seen, their presence almost always signaling impending calamity and widespread devastation. This particular deathbird, with its skeletal wings and piercing, malevolent gaze, seemed to embody the very essence of the shattering, its mournful cries echoing through the valley like a dirge for their dying world. Its appearance was not merely a bad omen, it was a profound spiritual signal, a confirmation of the village's precarious position on the precipice of utter ruin. The Deathbird's presence served as a terrifying reminder that even as they fought amongst themselves, larger, more primal forces were at play, forces that cared nothing for their petty squabbles and sought only to reclaim the lands for the realm of death. Its shadow cast a pall over both factions, a shared fear that transcended their ideological differences, if only for a fleeting moment. As the Shattering's wars raged with unprecedented ferocity beyond the confines of their secluded valley, the village's isolation, once a protective shield, became a fragile illusion. The sounds of distant battles, the plumes of smoke rising from ravaged lands, and the occasional terrified refugee stumbling into their territory all served as constant reminders that their sanctuary was not impenetrable. The chaos of the outside world, a maelstrom of demigod conflicts, and the relentless march of destructive armies slowly but surely encroached upon their borders. Their carefully constructed palisade, their ancient rites, and even the power of the Black Flame seemed insignificant against the sheer scale of the devastation unfolding across the lands between. The illusion of safety, meticulously maintained for generations, was now shattering, much like the Elden Ring itself. The villagers, both Roderika's followers and the Nihilist faction, began to understand that their fate was inextricably linked to the larger conflict, and that their isolation, once a strength, was now a vulnerability. The ultimate manifestation of this encroaching chaos came in the form of sporadic temporal rifts, tearing open within the village itself. The Elden Ring's fracture, a cataclysmic event that had shattered the very fabric of reality, caused localized distortions in time and space. These rifts, appearing without warning in various locations across the divided village, offered terrifying glimpses of past and future ruin. Some rifts showed spectral images of their ancestors, their faces contorted in agony as they faced unknown threats, while others revealed chilling visions of a desolate, ash choked future, their homes reduced to rubble, their spirits scattered to the winds. These temporal anomalies were not mere illusions, they were tangible tears in the fabric of reality, brief but potent windows into the potential futures that awaited them, or the forgotten pasts that had shaped their present. The rifts served as a constant, unsettling reminder of the profound instability of their world, a world where even time itself was no longer linear, and where the past, present, and future were all intertwined in a terrifying dance of destruction. The village, once a bastion of tradition and stability, was now a temporal anomaly, a microcosm of the shattered lands between, caught between the echoes of a glorious past and the terrifying specter of an uncertain and likely ruinous future. Following the cataclysmic events of the shattering, which plunged the lands between into an age of unending conflict and decay, the timeline now advances to the age of the Tarnished, what many consider the modern era. It is in this fractured realm, centuries after the demigods waged their devastating war, that a new yet ancient force stirs. The tarnished individuals once exiled from the lands between for losing the grace of the Erd Tree begin to awaken. Guided by a faint, almost forgotten light, a specific tarnished, our protagonist, emerges from a long slumber. This awakening is not random, but a deliberate act of the greater will, the outer god that governs the Golden Order, seeking to restore its dominion over the lands between. The Tarnished is a vessel, a potential champion to mend the fractured Elden Ring, or perhaps to forge a new path entirely. Almost immediately upon their awakening, the Tarnished encounters Melina, a mysterious maiden without a true past or a clear purpose beyond her immediate mission. She offers an accord, a pact that binds her to the Tarnished as their finger maiden, a guide and spiritual conduit. In exchange for traversing the perilous lands between and reaching the foot of the Erd Tree, she promises to turn runes, the fragmented essence of the Elden Ring, into strength. Her ultimate goal remains veiled, but her guidance is crucial, propelling the Tarnished towards the Erd Tree, the colossal golden tree that dominates the landscape and symbolizes the Golden Order's power. This accord is more than a simple transaction. It is the catalyst for the Tarnished's journey, providing the means to grow in power and navigate the treacherous world. The initial steps of the Tarnished's journey lead them through the ravaged lands, culminating in an encounter with Stormvale Castle, a formidable fortress guarding the path to the Erd Tree. This castle is the domain of Godric the Grafted, one of Marika's many demigod children, and a direct descendant of the Eternal Queen. Godric, a grotesque figure who has grafted the limbs of countless warriors onto his own body in a desperate attempt to gain strength, represents the depravity and ambition that consumed Marika's lineage after the shattering. His rule over Limgrave is tyrannical, marked by cruelty and a relentless pursuit of power, even at the cost of his own humanity. The confrontation with Godric is the Tarnished's first major trial, a brutal introduction to the power and madness that define the demigods. It also serves as a stark reminder of the Golden Order's fractured state, with its supposed protectors, now its most monstrous inhabitants. Within the shadowed halls of Stormvale Castle, or perhaps shortly after, the Tarnished encounters Rogier, a fellow Tarnished and a skilled sorcerer. Rogier is not driven by the same ambition as many of his peers. Instead, he is consumed by a scholarly pursuit, investigating the dark secrets that underpin the lands between. He shares cryptic knowledge of the Night of the Black Knives, a pivotal event that occurred long before the Tarnished's awakening. This fateful night saw the assassination of Godwyn the Golden, Marika's firstborn son, by a group of shadowy assassins wielding blades imbued with the rune of death. Rogier's investigations lead him to believe that Rani, another of Marika's demigod children and a powerful Empyrean, was deeply involved in this conspiracy. He hints at a deeper, more insidious plot, suggesting that the Black Knives, a clandestine group of Numen assassins, were not merely mercenaries, but instruments of a grander design, potentially orchestrated to sever the very concept of immortality from the demigods. This revelation begins to unravel the carefully constructed facade of the Golden Order, exposing its hidden vulnerabilities and the long simmering resentments within Marika's own family. As the Tarnished progresses, the full scope of the shattering, the devastating war that tore the lands between asunder, becomes clearer. This was not a localized conflict, but a continent-wide catastrophe, a brutal struggle among Marika's demigod children for control of the Elden Ring. Each demigod, inheriting fragments of the Elden Ring, known as Great Runes, sought to become the Elden Lord, leading to a prolonged and bloody conflict that left the land scarred and its inhabitants suffering. The shattering was a direct consequence of Marika's decision to shatter the Elden Ring, an act whose motivations remained shrouded in mystery, but whose consequences were undeniably catastrophic. The war not only fractured the physical landscape, but also the spiritual and political order, creating a power vacuum that allowed monstrous entities and ancient evils to resurface. The Tarnished learns that the demigods, once revered, are now largely self-serving tyrants, their power corrupted and their ambitions unchecked, further highlighting the decay of the Golden Order. In the Round Table Hold, a sanctuary for Tarnished seeking guidance and respite, the Tarnished encounters Fia, the deathbed companion. Fia, a mysterious woman who offers comfort through embraces, holds a dark secret. She is intimately connected to those who live in death, beings who defy the Golden Order's natural cycle of life and death, their souls unnaturally tethered to their decaying bodies. Fia reveals that her purpose is to nurture and protect these beings, whom the Golden Order relentlessly hunts and purges. Her connection stems from the stolen rune of death, a fragment of the Elden Ring that once governed the true cycle of death. This rune, stolen by Rani and used in the Night of the Black Knives, was subsequently sealed away, leading to the current state of undeath in the lands between. Fia's narrative challenges the Golden Order's dogma, suggesting that death itself has been corrupted, and that those who live in death are not inherently evil, but simply victims of a broken cosmic order. Her quest to mend the broken cycle of death introduces a moral ambiguity to the Tarnished's journey, forcing them to question the righteousness of the Golden Order's decrees. Venturing deeper into the wilderness, far from the established strongholds of the demigods, the Tarnished stumbles upon the Shaman village. This hidden settlement, nestled amidst ancient ruins and overgrown landscapes, is home to a community of shamans, its inhabitants deeply distrustful of outsiders. Their isolation is a deliberate act, a means of preserving their ancient traditions and avoiding the persecution of the Golden Order. The village is a relic of a bygone era, its customs and beliefs predating the rise of Marika and the Golden Order. The shamans practice a form of primordial magic, drawing power from the very essence of the earth and the ancient spirits that dwell within it. Their distrust of the tarnished is rooted in centuries of oppression, as the Golden Order systematically eradicated any belief system that challenged its supremacy, particularly those connected to the primordial crucible. Within the shaman village, the elders and wise women speak of the crucible, a concept largely forgotten or demonized by the Golden Order. They explain that the crucible was the primordial form of the Erd tree, the crucible of all life in the lands between, where all forms of life were once intertwined and undifferentiated. It represented a time before the strict classifications and hierarchies imposed by the Golden Order, a time when creatures like the misbegotten, beings with animalistic features and human forms, were not considered aberrations but natural expressions of life. The shamans believe that the Erd tree, in its current form, is a refined and restrictive version of the crucible, its golden glow a veneer over a much wilder, more chaotic origin. They lament the Golden Order's suppression of the crucible's worship, seeing it as an act of hubris that severed the lands between from its true primordial essence. Their reverence for the crucible provides a stark contrast to the Golden Order's rigid dogma, suggesting that Marika's reign was not a benevolent enlightenment, but a forceful imposition of a new world order. Through their interactions with the village elders, the Tarnished learns more about Marika's early reign, a period often romanticized by the Golden Order. The shamans recount how Marika, in her ascent to power, actively suppressed the worship of the crucible. She saw its primordial, undifferentiated nature as a threat to the ordered, hierarchical society she envisioned under the Golden Order. This suppression was not merely ideological, it was a brutal campaign to eradicate all vestiges of the old ways, leading to the persecution of those who continued to revere the crucible. The shamans describe Marika's growing tyranny, her transformation from a revered goddess to a ruthless queen who would brook no dissent. They reveal that the Golden Order, far from being a benevolent force, was built upon the ashes of older, more natural belief systems, its golden light casting long shadows over the truths it sought to bury. This historical perspective from the shamans offers a crucial counter-narrative to the official history propagated by the Golden Order, painting Marika not as a flawless deity, but as a powerful, ambitious ruler who reshaped the world to fit her vision. The shamans also shed light on the plight of the omens, cursed beings shunned and reviled by the Golden Order. They explain that the omens, born with horns and other grotesque features, are direct descendants of the crucible. Their physical characteristics are not a curse, but a manifestation of their deep connection to the primordial form of the Erd tree, a legacy of a time when all life was fluid and diverse. The Golden Order, in its pursuit of purity and order, deemed these physical traits abominable, branding omens as cursed and subjecting them to brutal persecution. Many omens were born into royalty, only to be imprisoned and shackled beneath the capital, their horns removed in agonizing rituals to conform to the Golden Order's aesthetic. The shamans argue that the omens are not evil, but simply embody a truth that the Golden Order desperately tried to erase, that life, in its most ancient form, was wild, untamed, and multifaceted. Their suffering is a testament to the Golden Order's intolerance and its unwavering commitment to its own narrow definition of perfection. A particularly insightful shaman reveals a profound secret about Marika's consort, Radagon. The shaman explains that Radagon was not always Marika's husband, nor was he always a part of her. Instead, Radagon was once a separate entity, a powerful warrior and a champion of the Golden Order, before he mysteriously merged with Marika. This revelation shatters the conventional understanding of Marika and Radagon as distinct individuals, suggesting a deeper, more complex, and perhaps even forced union. The shaman hints that this merging was not a natural occurrence, but a deliberate act, possibly orchestrated by the greater will or by Marika herself, to consolidate power or to achieve some unknown cosmic purpose. The implications of this revelation are vast, suggesting that Marika's identity is not as singular as it appears, and that the very foundation of the Golden Order is built upon a profound duality. This duality, the shaman implies, is a source of immense power but also inherent instability, a constant tension within the very heart of the Elden Ring. The village, in its long history of preserving ancient knowledge, guards a fragment of an ancient prophecy. This prophecy, carefully passed down through generations, speaks of a looming threat, hinting at the return of a Lord of Chaos. The shamans interpret this as a force that will seek to unravel the fabric of the lands between, to return it to a primordial undifferentiated state, or perhaps to something even more destructive. The prophecy is vague, its details obscured by time and allegorical language, but its core message is one of impending upheaval. The shamans, having witnessed the rise and fall of empires and the suppression of their own ancient ways, understand the cyclical nature of power and the ever present potential for radical change. They fear this Lord of Chaos, not necessarily as an evil entity, but as a force that could dismantle the fragile order that remains, potentially ushering in an era of unpredictable and uncontrollable change, a return to a pre-Erdtree state of existence, or a descent into pure madness. Their apprehension underscores the deep-seated anxieties within the lands between, a world teetering on the brink of another cataclysm. As the Tarnished continues their journey, they encounter Gurunk, the beast clergyman, a hulking, mournful figure residing in the bestial sanctum. Gurunk, despite his priestly title, harbors a dark secret, a relentless, insatiable craving for deathroot. Deathroot, a grotesque plant that grows from the corpses of those who have died an unnatural death, is intimately tied to the Rune of Death. The Rune of Death, once stolen and sealed, has scattered its power throughout the lands between, creating the phenomenon of those who live in death and giving rise to Deathroot. Gorank's obsession with consuming Deathroot is a desperate attempt to gather the fragmented power of the Rune of Death, possibly to restore the true cycle of death or to harness its power for some unknown purpose. His tormented state, his constant hunger, and his cryptic pronouncements all point to a deep connection with the fundamental forces of life and death that have been disrupted by the shattering of the Elden Ring. His presence serves as a grim reminder of the enduring consequences of the Night of the Black Knives and the pervasive influence of the stolen Rune of Death, even in the most unexpected corners of the lands between. As the age of the Tarnished dawned, a spectral figure began to haunt the lands between, a ghostly projection of Rani, one of Marika's Empyrean children. Her ethereal form, a chilling blue, hinted at a deeper, more insidious plot brewing beneath the surface of the shattered realm. Rani, dissatisfied with the Golden Order and its rigid dogma, sought to overthrow its dominion and usher in a new age, an age of stars, where the influence of the greater will would wane and the fate of the world would be guided by the chill of the moon. Her spectral appearances were not random. They were calculated whispers, subtle manipulations designed to draw in a capable champion, a Tarnished, to serve as her instrument. This era, the modern era, was ripe for such a rebellion, the lands between already fractured and yearning for change, even if that change meant further upheaval. The newly arrived Tarnished, guided by the whispers of grace, soon found themselves at the gates of Stormvale Castle, a formidable fortress guarding the path to the Erdtree. Here, their progress was challenged by Margit the Fell Omen, a grotesque creature of horns and shadows. Margit was not merely a guardian, he was a projection of Morgott, the veiled monarch, the last true king of Leyndell. Morgoth, in his twisted devotion to the Golden Order and his mother Marika, had taken it upon himself to defend the capital from any who he deemed unworthy of lordship, a category that in his eyes included all tarnished. His ferocity was a testament to his unwavering loyalty, a desperate attempt to maintain the crumbling facade of the Golden Order's power. The battle with Margit was a test, a brutal initiation into the harsh realities of the lands between, a world where even the most seemingly insignificant encounters held deeper, more tragic implications. Amidst the chaos and decay, the shamans, ancient practitioners of forbidden arts, began to issue dire warnings. Their prophecies spoke of the flame of frenzy, an apocalyptic force that lay dormant beneath the very foundations of the lands between. This terrifying power, an antithesis to the ordered existence fostered by the Erd Tree, threatened to engulf all creation in a searing, indiscriminate conflagration. The shamans, with their deep connection to the earth and their understanding of primordial energies, recognized the subtle tremors of its awakening, a slow burn that promised total annihilation. Their warnings, often dismissed as the ramblings of madmen, were a stark reminder of the fragile balance of power within the lands between and the ever present threat of forces far older and more destructive than even the shattering itself. The Tarnished, having overcome the challenges of Limgrave, eventually ventured into Liurnia of the Lakes, a vast and ethereal region dominated by a shimmering, stagnant lake. Here they discovered a land embroiled in a bitter, long-standing conflict. On one side stood the sorcerers of the Academy of Raya Lucaria, a prestigious institution of magical learning, fiercely protective of their arcane knowledge and their independence. On the other were the Carian royals, the ancient ruling family of Liurnia, who, despite their diminished power, still held sway over a significant portion of the land. This conflict, a clash of ancient traditions and burgeoning magical power, was a microcosm of the larger struggles within the lands between, a testament to the enduring divisions that plagued the shattered realm. The Tarnished found themselves navigating this treacherous political landscape, often caught between the warring factions, each seeking to leverage the Tarnished's growing strength for their own ends. It was in Liurnia that the Tarnished encountered Blade, a towering half-wolf warrior, a loyal servant of Rani. Blad, despite his imposing stature and fierce demeanor, was deeply devoted to his mistress. He aided the Tarnished in their endeavors, often offering cryptic advice and unwavering support. His loyalty was a striking contrast to the general distrust and an animosity shown towards the Tarnished by many inhabitants of the lands between. Bled's unwavering dedication to Rani, even in the face of her shadow-bound fate, hinted at the depth of their bond and the significance of Rani's ambitions. His presence served as a tangible link to Rani's overarching plot, a direct connection to the Empyrean who sought to reshape the very fabric of existence. Through Blide and other enigmatic figures, the Tarnished began to uncover the truth behind the stagnation of the stars. General Radon, one of Marika's demigod children, had through sheer force of will and immense gravitational magic halted the celestial bodies in their tracks. This seemingly impossible feat had profound implications, not least for Rani. The movement of the stars was intrinsically linked to her destiny, a cosmic dance that dictated the unfolding of her fate. Radon's act of defiance, born of a twisted sense of duty and a desire to preserve the Golden Order, inadvertently stalled Rani's grand design. The shamans of the village, with their deep understanding of celestial mechanics and ancient prophecies, recognized the significance of Radon's actions. They understood that the unbinding of the stars was a prerequisite for Rani's ascension and the forging of her new age.